A man ruled an entire city for 38 years. Politicians bowed. Detectives looked the other way. Rivals disappeared without a trace. But behind the legend, behind the fear, behind every calculated move, Lucien Vale had never heard a single sound in his life. He was deaf. And the day a nobody Maid pulled a hardened obstruction from his ear canal, the most powerful man in the underworld heard the world for the first time and realized everything he'd ever known was a lie. Someone had paid to keep him deaf, and that someone was his own father. If this story doesn't have you gripping your seat by the end, I don't know what will. Stay with me all the way through. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story travels. Now settle in. This is going to be a long one. The rain came sideways that night. Not the polite kind of rain that taps on windows and makes people feel cozy inside their apartments. This was the other kind. The angry kind. The kind that turns gutters into rivers and makes the whole city smell like rust and wet concrete. It battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ravenmore Heights like it had a personal grudge against the place, like even the sky wanted to tear it down. Ravenmore Heights sat on a hill overlooking the harbor district, a brutalist fortress of black glass and reinforced steel that looked less like a home and more like a tomb someone had built for a king who wasn't dead yet. 3 stories above ground, 2 below. Surveillance cameras on every corner. Armed guards rotating shifts every 4 hours. Motion sensors embedded in the lawn. The kind of security that doesn't just say keep out, it says try it. And at the very top, in a study lined with books he'd never heard read aloud, sat Lucien Vale, 53 years old, silver threading through black hair that he kept slicked back tight against his skull. A face carved from something harder than bone. All sharp angles and deep-set eyes that never blinked when they should have. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit even when he was alone, even at 11 o'clock at night, because Lucien Vale did not believe in comfort. Comfort was a luxury for people who could afford to let their guard down, and Lucien had never been one of those people, not once in his entire life. He sat behind a mahogany desk the size of a small boat, reading reports. Financial summaries. Territory maps. Police rotation schedules for the harbor district. His eyes moved across the pages with a speed that would have unsettled anyone watching, absorbing, cataloging, cross-referencing. His mind was the real weapon. Always had been. Because Lucien Vale couldn't hear a damn thing. Not the rain, not the thunder that cracked like a rifle shot above the mansion, not the footsteps of the guards patrolling the hallway outside his study, not his own breathing, nothing. The world existed for him as a silent movie. Vivid, detailed, full of movement and meaning, but utterly, completely mute. He'd been deaf since he was 4 years old. That was the story, anyway. The story everyone knew. Congenital nerve damage, the doctor said. Irreversible. His auditory nerves had simply never developed properly. A genetic misfire, a cruel accident of biology. His father had taken him to specialists across 3 countries. Every one of them shook their heads. Every one of them said the same thing. Your son will never hear. And so Lucien learns to live without sound the way a man learns to live without a limb. You don't get over it. You just get around it. You compensate. You adapt. You turn the absence into something else. For Lucien, silence became a superpower. He learned to read lips before he learned to read books. By age 7, he could follow a conversation across a crowded room just by watching mouths move. By 12, he could detect lying. The micro-expressions, the way a person's jaw tightened half a second before they said something they didn't mean. The way their eyes drifted left when they were constructing a story instead of recalling one. By 20, he was better at reading people than any interrogator, any psychologist, any cop. His father, Dominic Vale, had built the organization from the ground up. Smuggling, extortion, protection rackets, and eventually the kind of high-level financial crime that blurred the line between the underworld and Wall Street. Dominic was old school, loud, brutal, the kind of man who solved problems with his fists first and his brain second. He ran the operation like a warlord through fear and violence and the occasional public execution of someone who'd gotten too ambitious. When Dominic allegedly died of a heart attack 12 years ago, the organization passed to Lucien, and everyone expected it to fall apart within a year. A deaf man running a criminal empire? The wolves circled, rival families sharpened their knives, Even Lucien's own captains started making quiet plans for what came next. They underestimated him. Within 18 months, Lucien had consolidated every territory his father ever held and taken 3 more. He didn't do it with violence, not primarily. He did it with information, with patience, with the terrifying ability to sit across from a man at a negotiating table and know exactly what that man was thinking before the man himself knew. People started calling him the Silent King. They meant it as a joke at first. Then they meant it as a warning. Eventually, they meant it the way you mean it when you talk about something that frightens you so deeply you can barely say its name. Lucien Vale, the man who heard nothing and saw everything. For 38 years, that was enough. Then Celeste Navarro walked into his study with a dust rag and a mop bucket, and everything changed. She was 27, short, 5'3" on a generous day. Dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail that she kept pushing behind her ears. Brown skin, calloused hands, the kind of tired eyes that come from working too many jobs for too little money. She'd been hired 3 days ago to replace a maid who'd quit without notice, which happened a lot at Ravenmore Heights. The staff turnover was brutal. People couldn't handle the silence, the tension, the constant feeling of being watched by cameras and armed men, and the ghost of something terrible lurking just beneath the surface of everything. Celeste didn't seem to care about any of that. She came in, looked around the study, and started cleaning. Not timidly, not with the exaggerated deference the other staff members showed. She cleaned the way a person cleans when they've been cleaning their whole life and they're good at it, and they don't have time to be nervous about whose room they're in. Lucien watched her from behind his desk. He watched everyone. It was reflexive, the way breathing is reflexive. But something about her held his attention differently. She moved through the room without fear. That alone was remarkable. Most people who entered his private study moved like they were walking through a minefield. Celeste moved like she was in her own kitchen. She dusted the bookshelves. She wiped down the windowsills. She got on her knees and scrubbed a stain near the fireplace that had been there for months and that no one else had bothered with. Lucien pretended to read his reports, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. Then she looked at him. Not at his face, the way everyone else did. Not at his hands, which he used to sign occasionally with his personal translator. She looked at his right ear, and her expression changed. Lucien had spent a lifetime cataloging human expressions the way other people catalog songs or recipes. He knew the full taxonomy of fear, the widened eyes, the clenched teeth, the slight backward lean. He knew contempt, pity, amusement, boredom, lust, rage. He could identify an emotion on a person's face faster than most people could name a color. What he saw on Celeste's face was none of those things. It was recognition, like she'd spotted something specific, something medical. She put down her dust rag and walked toward him. Lucien's right hand slid beneath the desk, fingers closing around the grip of the Beretta he kept mounted to the underside of the drawer. A reflex. In his world, unexpected approaches ended badly more often than not. 2 years ago, an assassin had disguised himself as a plumber to get close enough for a kill shot. Lucien had read the man's intentions in his posture and put 3 rounds in his chest before he could draw. But Celeste wasn't an assassin. Her body language was all wrong for it. No tension in her shoulders, no controlled breathing, no calculated positioning. She was just walking toward him with the same straightforward purpose she'd brought to scrubbing that stain near the fireplace. She stopped 2 feet away and pointed at his ear. Then she mimed a pulling motion. Lucien stared at her. He didn't release the gun. Celeste held up both hands. Open, empty, palms out. The universal gesture. I'm not a threat. Then she pointed at his ear again and made a face that Lucien recognized immediately. Concern. Genuine concern. The kind that doesn't calculate its own advantage. In Lucien Vale's experience, that expression was rarer than a loaded gun in a church. He didn't know why he let her. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the late hour. Maybe some part of him, buried beneath decades of control and calculation, was simply tired of being untouchable. Whatever the reason, he leaned his head slightly to the right. Celeste moved closer. She smelled like floor cleaner and cheap soap. Her fingers were warm. She tilted his head gently, firmly, but gently, and looked into his ear canal with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. Later, when Lucien replayed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, he would remember the feeling of her fingers on the side of his face. It was the first time in years, maybe decades, that someone had touched him without either wanting something from him or trying to kill him. She reached in with her fingernails, carefully, precisely, and gripped something. Pain. A sharp, bright spike of it that made Lucien's jaw clench and his hand tighten on the gun. Then a scraping sensation deep inside the canal. Then pressure. Then release. Celeste stepped back, holding a small, dark, hardened mass between her thumb and forefinger. Compacted wax, calcium deposits, and something else. Something that looked almost deliberate in its density, like it had been packed in there and left to calcify over years. Over decades. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. Not with violence, not with fire, with sound. It came all at once, like a dam breaking. The rain, not silent anymore, but deafening, hammering, a wall of noise that hit Lucien's consciousness like a truck. The thunder. Not a flash of light anymore, but a physical force that rolled through the walls and shook the windows and vibrated in his chest. The clock on the mantel. Ticking, ticking, ticking. A mechanical heartbeat he'd stared at for years without ever knowing it made a sound. His own breathing. That was the one that broke him. Lucien staggered backward out of his chair, knocking it over. His hands went to his ears, both of them, pressing against his skull like he could push the sound back out. His eyes were wide. His mouth was open. He was making a noise, a raw, guttural sound that he'd never heard himself make before because he'd never heard himself make anything before. He hit the wall behind his desk and slid down to the floor. Celeste stood across the room with that dark little mass still between her fingers, watching the most powerful man in the city come apart at the seams. She didn't run. She didn't scream for the guards. She just stood there, watching him with the same steady concern she'd shown when she first looked at his ear. The room was so loud. Everything was so loud. The rain was screaming. The clock was hammering. His heart. He could hear his own heart. A wet, frantic percussion inside his ribcage that sounded like something trapped, something desperate, something that had been pounding in silence for 53 years and had finally been heard. Lucien sat on the floor of his study with his back against the wall and his hands over his ears and his mouth open, breathing in ragged gasps, and for the first time in his life, he heard himself breathe. He didn't move for 45 minutes. Celeste sat on the floor across from him and waited. When Lucien finally lowered his hands, the first thing he did was look at her. Not the way he usually looked at people, analyzing, cataloging, calculating. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at someone who just pulled him out of the water. Then he looked at the hardened mass she'd placed on the edge of his desk. And his expression changed, from shock to something colder, something sharper, something that had kept him alive and in power for nearly 4 decades. Suspicion. Because Lucien Vale had been examined by doctors his entire life, specialists, audiologists, neurologists. He'd been poked and prodded and scanned and tested more times than he could count. He'd spent millions on consultations. He'd traveled to clinics in 4 countries, and not one of them, not a single one, had found a blockage that a 27-year-old maid with no medical degree had spotted in 30 seconds, with nothing but her eyes and her fingernails. That wasn't possible, unless someone had made sure they wouldn't find it. The thought landed in his mind like a bullet, and it didn't leave. He looked at the blockage on his desk. He looked at Celeste. He looked at the door. Then he stood up, straightened his suit, and walked to the intercom panel on the wall. A panel he'd never used because he'd never been able to hear it. He pressed the button. The electronic beep startled him. He pressed it again, holding it down. A voice came through the speaker. Male, young, nervous. "Sir?" The sound of a human voice directed at him. Not lips moving in silence, but actual sound waves hitting his eardrums and being processed by his brain nearly knocked him sideways. It was overwhelming. Not the word itself, but the texture of it. The pitch. The vibration. The way the S hissed and the R rolled and the whole thing carried emotion inside it like a vessel carrying water. He could hear that this guard was afraid, not see it, hear it, the tremor in the vowel, the tightness in the consonants. Fear had a sound, and it sounded like a wire pulled too tight. Lucien opened his mouth. He'd spoken before. He'd learned to speak as a child, clumsily, imperfectly, with the flat intonation of someone who had never heard their own voice. But now, for the first time, he could hear himself form the words. His voice was rough, deeper than he'd imagined. It sounded like gravel dragged across concrete. Get Marcus. A pause. Sir, it's almost midnight. Get Marcus. The intercom went dead. Lucien stared at the speaker for a long moment, then turned back to Celeste. She was still standing by the desk. She'd picked up her dust rag again and was folding it neatly, like she was getting ready to leave. Like she'd done her job, the cleaning and the other thing, and now it was time to go. Lucien crossed the room in 4 strides. He stood directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. He was 6'2". She barely came up to his chest. He wanted to ask her how she'd known, how she'd seen what dozens of specialists had missed. But the words felt clumsy in his mouth, and the sound of his own voice was still so foreign and so strange that each syllable felt like stepping on broken glass. Instead, he pointed at a chair in the corner of the study. The gesture was clear. Sit. Stay. Celeste looked at the chair. She looked at him. For a moment, something passed across her face. Not fear exactly, but the recognition that she'd just stepped into something much larger than a cleaning job. Then she sat down, put the folded dust rag on her lap, and waited. Marcus Vane arrived 17 minutes later, still pulling on his jacket, rain dripping from his hair. Marcus was Lucien's head of security, a former Marine with a shaved head and the kind of calm, competent demeanor that made you feel either very safe or very threatened, depending on which side you were on. He'd worked for Lucien for 11 years, and in that time, he'd seen things that would keep a normal person in therapy for the rest of their life. But when he walked into the study and Lucien actually spoke to him, in a voice that resonated and responded and adjusted its volume based on the distance between them, Marcus Vane stopped in the doorway like he'd been shot. "Close the door," Lucien said. Marcus closed the door. His eyes were wide. His mouth was slightly open. Lucien could hear his breathing, fast, shallow, the breathing of a man processing something impossible. "You can hear," Marcus said. Not a question, a statement of disbelief. "Sit down." Marcus sat. He looked at Celeste. He looked at the blockage on the desk. He looked back at Lucien. "How?" Lucien picked up the hardened mass and held it between his fingers the way Celeste had held it. "This was inside my ear." She removed it. Marcus stared at the object, then he stared at Celeste. His hand drifted toward the gun on his hip. Not aggressively, just instinctively, the way a soldier's hand gravitates toward a weapon when something doesn't add up. "Stand down," Lucien said. The words came out harder than he intended. The sound of his own authority, heard for the first time, was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Marcus dropped his hand. "I want you to find Dr. Adrian Mercer," Lucien said. Every word was deliberate, measured, like he was learning to speak all over again, which, in a way, he was. "I want him at his clinic by 1 o'clock tonight. No excuses. No delays." "Mercer? Your physician?" "My former physician." Marcus read the temperature in the room. He'd been with Lucien long enough to know that the colder the voice, the hotter the rage underneath. Right now, Lucien's voice was ice. "What do I tell him?" "Tell him I want a full examination. Tell him it's urgent." "And if he refuses?" Lucien looked at Marcus with those deep-set, unblinking eyes. "He won't refuse." Marcus stood. He buttoned his jacket. He glanced at Celeste one more time, a look that was equal parts confusion and professional assessment, like he was trying to figure out if she was a miracle or a threat. Then he left. The study fell quiet. Lucien stood by the window, staring out at the rain-lashed city. He could hear it now. The city. Not just see its lights and its movement and its distant choreography of cars and people, but hear it. Sirens in the harbor district, the low moan of foghorns, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, a dog barking somewhere far below, sharp and repetitive and meaningless. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes, and for a moment, he just listened. The world was louder than he'd ever imagined, louder and messier and more chaotic. There was no order to it, no structure, no silence to organize the noise into something manageable. It was just sound, endless, overlapping, relentless sound, pouring in through the ear canal that had been blocked his entire life. His entire life. The rage was building. He could feel it in his chest, in his jaw, in the way his fists kept clenching and unclenching at his sides. Someone had done this to him. Someone had deliberately ensured that a simple, removable blockage stayed in place for nearly 50 years. Someone had paid doctors to lie. Someone had watched him grow up in silence and done nothing. Who and why? Behind him, Celeste shifted in her chair. The sound of fabric against leather made Lucien flinch. He wasn't used to ambient noise. Every small sound registered like a gunshot. The creak of the chair, the rustle of her clothes, the soft exhale of her breath. He turned to face her. "Who are you?" he asked. She looked up at him. Her expression was tired. Not afraid, not calculating, just tired. "The maid," she said. "No one just removes something like that by accident. How did you know?" Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother. She was deaf too. Same thing. Blockage that built up over years. Doctors kept telling her it was nerve damage. They were wrong. I recognized the way you tilted your head, the way you favored one side. I've seen it before." "You're not a doctor." "No, I'm a maid who grew up taking care of a deaf woman. Sometimes that's enough." Lucien stared at her. In his world, simple answers were almost always lies. People had motivations, agendas, angles. Nobody did anything for free. Nobody helped without expecting something in return. But he couldn't find the angle with Celeste. Her body language was open. Her eyes were steady. Her voice, and he was still marveling at the concept of hearing someone's voice, of receiving information through sound instead of sight, was flat, matter-of-fact, unburdened by hidden intention. She was telling the truth. That scared him more than anything else that had happened tonight. "You're going to stay here," Lucien said, "in the mansion, until I figure out what's happening. I have a shift tomorrow at the diner on 5th. You don't have a shift anymore. You work here now, full-time." "I didn't agree to that." "I'm not asking." Their eyes locked. Something passed between them. Not affection, not hostility, but a mutual recognition of stubbornness. Two people who'd spent their whole lives surviving, meeting at a point where survival meant very different things. Celeste looked away first, not out of submission, out of exhaustion. "Fine," she said. "But I'm not cleaning the third-floor bathrooms. They're disgusting." Something shifted in Lucien's face. Not a smile. Lucien Vale didn't smile. But the faintest relaxation of the muscles around his mouth. The closest thing to amusement he'd allowed himself in years. "Noted," he said. The drive downtown took 22 minutes. Lucien sat in the back of the armored sedan, watching the city slide past through rain-streaked windows. But he wasn't watching the same way he always had. Now the visual information was supplemented, overwhelmed, really, by sound. The engine's low growl, the windshield wiper's rhythmic squeak, the driver's breathing, even, controlled, professional. Lucien kept touching his right ear. Gently, like probing a wound. The canal felt raw, tender, newly opened. The absence of the blockage left a phantom sensation, like a tooth socket after an extraction. Empty, where something had been lodged for so long that it had become part of him. Part of him. That phrase lodged itself in his brain and wouldn't leave. Something artificial had been part of him for almost 50 years. It had shaped his entire existence. Every relationship, every decision, every achievement, and every failure. The empire he'd built, the legend he'd become, the fear he'd cultivated, all of it grew from the silence that someone had imposed on him. Marcus sat in the front passenger seat, a radio earpiece in his left ear. Lucien could hear the faint crackle of static coming through it. He could hear Marcus's jaw tightening and releasing. He could hear the rain changing intensity as they passed under an overpass and then back into the open. Information. So much information. He'd always been extraordinary at processing visual data, but auditory data was a new dimension entirely. It was like someone had added a third axis to a two-dimensional world. Everything had depth now, distance, direction, subtlety. And deception had a sound. That was the thought that kept circling back, the thought that tightened his jaw and made his fingers curl against the leather seat. If voices carried truth the way he suspected, the way his first 30 minutes of hearing had already suggested, then his entire understanding of the people around him was about to change, for better or worse. Dr. Adrian Mercer's clinic occupied the top floor of a limestone building on the east side, 3 blocks from the financial district. It was the kind of clinic that didn't advertise. No sign out front, no listing in the phone book. You found Dr. Mercer through referral, through reputation, through the kind of whispered recommendation that circulated among people who could afford to pay for discretion as much as they paid for treatment. Mercer was already there when Lucien arrived. Marcus had seen to that. The doctor stood in the main examination room wearing slacks and a dress shirt hastily tucked in, his silver hair slightly disheveled. He was 61, trim, with the manicured hands and practiced smile of a man who'd spent his entire career making wealthy people feel comfortable. Lucien had known Mercer since he was 15 years old. The doctor had been his primary physician for nearly 4 decades, managing everything from routine checkups to the gunshot wound Lucien had taken in his left shoulder 8 years ago. Mercer had always been steady, reliable, the kind of man who looked you in the eye and told you the truth, or so Lucien had believed. Now, standing in the antiseptic brightness of the examination room, hearing the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, hearing them for the first time, Lucien looked at Dr. Adrian Mercer and saw something he'd never noticed before. Not in Mercer's face. Lucien's visual assessment of the doctor hadn't changed. The man was composed, professional, mildly inconvenienced by the late hour, but not alarmed. It was in his voice. "Lucien," Mercer said, extending a hand. "Marcus said it was urgent. What's going on?" And there it was. Buried beneath the professional warmth, beneath the practiced bedside manner, beneath the smooth, confident delivery of a man who'd spent 40 years sounding trustworthy, there was a frequency, a vibration, a thinness in the vowels that Lucien's newly functional hearing detected the way a dog detects a pitch humans can't hear. Fear. Not the obvious kind. Not the stuttering, sweating, looking for the exit kind. This was the deep kind. The kind that lives in the basement of a person's voice because it's been there so long it's become structural. The fear of a man who carries a secret so heavy that it has reshaped the very architecture of how he speaks. Lucien didn't take the offered hand. "I can hear," he said. Mercer's hand dropped. His face didn't change. Not visibly, not in any way that Lucien's decades of lip reading and expression analysis would have caught. But his voice did something extraordinary. It cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a tiny, almost imperceptible fracture in the smooth surface of his composure, like a hairline crack in fine china. You'd have to be listening for it to catch it. You'd have to be someone who'd just learned to hear, who was processing every auditory signal with the raw, unfiltered sensitivity of a newborn, to notice the way Dr. Adrian Mercer's carefully constructed vocal persona splintered for a quarter of a second before he pulled it back together. "That's remarkable," Mercer said. "How?" "That's what I'm here to find out." Lucien unbuttoned his overcoat and sat on the examination table. The paper crinkled beneath him. Another new sound. Full examination, both ears, right now. Of course. Mercer moved toward his equipment and Lucien watched his hands. Rock steady. Decades of surgical training had given the doctor manual control that his voice apparently couldn't match. "Let me get the otoscope." The examination took 4 minutes. Mercer looked in Lucien's left ear, then his right. He used a lighted scope, then a magnifying attachment, then a small camera that displayed the inner ear canal on a wall-mounted screen. Lucien watched the doctor's face the entire time, but more importantly, he listened to his breathing. It was changing, getting shorter, faster. The breaths of a man who was seeing something that confirmed his worst fear. Mercer straightened up. He removed his gloves. He walked to the sink and washed his hands, taking longer than necessary. Stalling. "The canal is clear," Mercer said, his back to Lucien. Water running, soap dispensing. The mechanical sounds of a man buying time. "Whatever was in there, it's gone now. Your hearing appears to be functional." "I know my hearing is functional. I'm hearing you right now." Yes, of course." "Turn around." Mercer turned off the water. He dried his hands slowly, methodically, each finger individually. Then he turned around. 38 years, Lucien said. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of the clinic, it filled the room like smoke. 38 years, you told me my hearing loss was permanent, congenital, irreversible. Lucien, a maid, a 27-year-old woman who cleans floors for a living, saw what you missed for 38 years. She reached in and pulled it out with her fingernails. "I can't explain." "Yes, you can." The words hung in the air between them. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The rain tapped against the clinic windows. Somewhere in the building, a pipe groaned. Lucien had interrogated hundreds of people in his life. He'd watched them squirm, watched them lie, watched them break. He was an expert at reading the moment when a person's resistance crumbles, when the wall they've built between their secret and the outside world develops a crack too wide to repair. He'd always observed that moment visually. Now he heard it. Mercer's breathing changed. The controlled, professional rhythm collapsed into something ragged, desperate, the breathing of a man who's been running for a very long time and has finally been caught. "How long?" Lucien asked. Mercer's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "How long, Adrian?" The doctor's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Since the beginning." Lucien didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. "The blockage was there when you were a child," Mercer said. Each word came out like a stone being dropped into deep water. "It was compound, calcium, compacted cerumen, and a small foreign object. A medical-grade sealant that was inserted deliberately to ensure the blockage would calcify and become permanent." "Inserted?" "Yes." "By whom?" Mercer's eyes went to the floor. His hands were shaking now. Lucien could see it and hear it, the faint rattle of the doctor's watch against his wrist. "By me." The silence that followed was not the silence Lucien had known his whole life. That silence had been absolute, total, an absence of something he'd never experienced. This silence was different. This silence was full of the buzzing lights and the tapping rain and the groaning pipes and Mercer's ragged breathing and Lucien's own heartbeat, which was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Why?" Lucien's voice was a blade, and Mercer broke. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages. The way a dam breaks, not in one dramatic rupture, but in a series of small failures, each one letting more through until the whole structure gives way. First, the hands. Mercer gripped the edge of the examination counter behind him, knuckles white, like a man holding onto a ledge. Then the posture. His shoulders curved inward, folding, compressing, as though the weight of what he was about to say was physically crushing him. Then the voice. "Your father," Mercer whispered. "Your father paid me." The words landed in Lucien's newly hearing ears like bullets, and the damage they did was worse than any physical wound he'd ever sustained. Worse than the shoulder, worse than the knife scar across his ribs from 1997. Worse than any of it. His father, Lucien Vale, the man who'd raised him, the man who'd taken him to specialists, the man who'd sat beside him in waiting rooms and held his hand while doctors delivered their verdicts, the man who'd told him, over and over, with lips that Lucien read with trusting, childish precision, "We'll get through this together, son." That man had paid to make him deaf. "He came to me when you were 4, Mercer continued. The confession was pouring out now, unstoppable, like a hemorrhage. He said he wanted you controllable, dependent. He was afraid that if you developed normally, you'd challenge him. You were already too observant, too smart. He wanted a son who would need him, who would rely on the organization, who would never be able to operate independently in the hearing world." Lucien's hand was trembling. He looked down at it, the hand that had held guns, signed documents, shaken hands with senators and murderers, the hand that had built an empire and watched it shake like a leaf. "Every examination," Lucien said slowly, "every specialist. Paid off? Every one. Your father's network was extensive. Anyone who got close to the truth was either bought or removed." Removed. There was an audiologist in Berlin, 2003. She ran an unauthorized test, found anomalies. She was dead within a week. Lucien closed his eyes. The sounds of the clinic pressed in on him. The lights, the rain, the pipes, Mercer's desperate breathing. And for a moment, he wished he was deaf again. Wished he could retreat into the silence that had been his home for 53 years. The silence that had been forced on him. The silence that was simultaneously his greatest strength and the evidence of the greatest betrayal he'd ever suffered. Then he opened his eyes. "My father is dead," Lucien said. "He died 12 years ago." And Mercer's face did something that Lucien had never seen a face do before. It apologized in advance. "No," Mercer whispered. "He didn't." The fluorescent lights buzzed, the rain tapped, the pipes groaned, and inside Lucien Vale's chest, something fundamental shifted, some load-bearing wall of identity, of self-understanding, of who he believed himself to be, cracked down the center and began to fall. Dominic Vale is alive, Mercer said. He's been alive this entire time. He's in a fortified estate outside the city. He's been running operations from behind the scenes for 12 years. Your entire reign— Mercer swallowed hard enough that Lucien could hear the gulp, could hear the saliva moving down the doctor's throat. Your entire reign has been managed, controlled. You've been a figurehead, Lucien. A puppet king in a puppet kingdom. Lucien sat on the examination table in a sterile clinic in the middle of a rainy night, and the world he had built, the empire, the legend, the silent king, collapsed around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. He didn't move for a long time. Then he stood up. He buttoned his overcoat. He straightened his cuffs. He walked to the door of the examination room with the deliberate, measured steps of a man who has just absorbed a mortal wound and refuses to fall. At the doorway, he stopped. He didn't turn around. "Don't leave this clinic," he said. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who has pushed his rage so deep that it's become something structural, something foundational, something that will not surface as screaming or violence, but as something far more dangerous. Calculation. If you try to run, Marcus will find you. If you call anyone, you will not see morning. He walked out into the rain. In the back of the sedan, Lucien stared at the city through the window. The wipers swept back and forth. The engine hummed. Marcus drove in silence. Real silence. The chosen kind. The kind that comes from reading the room and knowing that nothing you could say would help. Lucien's mind was a machine processing damage reports. His father was alive. His deafness had been manufactured. His reign was a fiction. Every decision he'd made for 38 years had been made inside a framework of control that he hadn't known existed. He was a king, yes, but a king on a leash so long he'd never felt it pull. Until now. The sedan pulled through the gates of Ravenmore Heights. The mansion loomed above them, black glass reflecting the storm. Lucien could hear the gates grinding shut behind them, the gravel crunching under the tires, the rain hammering the roof of the car. He got out. He stood in the rain for a moment, letting it soak through his overcoat, letting the cold water run down his face. He could hear it. Every drop, every impact. The rain had a voice, and it was speaking to him in a language he was only beginning to understand. Inside the mansion, he climbed the stairs to his study. Celeste was still in the chair where he'd left her. She'd fallen asleep, her head tilted against the wing of the chair, the folded dust rag still on her lap. Lucien stood in the doorway and watched her sleep. He could hear her breathing, slow, rhythmic, peaceful. The breathing of a person with a clean conscience. A sound so foreign in this house, in this world, in this life, that it felt like something from another planet. He sat down behind his desk. He pulled out a locked drawer and removed a file he hadn't opened in 12 years. His father's death certificate. Cause of death. Cardiac arrest. Signed by Dr. Adrian Mercer. He stared at the document. Then he reached for the phone on his desk. Another device he'd never used, had never been able to use, and dialed a number from memory, a number he'd read on a piece of paper years ago and memorized because Lucien Vale memorized everything, even things he thought he'd never need. The phone rang 3 times. A voice answered, groggy, male, old. Who is this? Lucien didn't speak. He just listened. To the voice. To the breathing behind it, to the ambient sounds in the background. A television playing low, a clock ticking, the unmistakable acoustics of a large, well-furnished room. He listened for 30 seconds. Then he hung up. His father's voice. Older, thinner, but unmistakable. Dominic Vale was alive. Lucien set the phone down. He looked at the death certificate. He looked at the sleeping maid in the corner chair. He looked at the dark mass of compacted material that still sat on the edge of his desk like a museum exhibit of his stolen life. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out a fresh legal pad, and began to write. Names, dates, connections. Every person who had ever been part of the machine that kept him deaf and controlled. Every doctor, every associate, every captain in his organization who might have known. He wrote for 2 hours, filling page after page with the architecture of his own betrayal. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the Silent King was building something new. Not an empire, not a legend, a war. And somewhere across the city, in a fortified estate that officially didn't exist, an old man sat in a grand room watching television, completely unaware that the son he'd crippled, the puppet he'd controlled, the deaf king he'd created, had just heard the sound of the world for the first time, and was coming for him. Lucien didn't sleep. He sat behind his desk until the storm outside died, and the first gray light of morning crept across the harbor like something ashamed of itself. The legal pad in front of him was full. 12 pages of names, dates, dollar amounts, and a web of connections so dense it looked like the ravings of a paranoid mind. Except Lucien Vale wasn't paranoid. He was meticulous. He always had been. The difference now was that he could hear, and hearing changed everything. The mansion woke up around him in layers. First the distant clatter of the kitchen, pots, running water, the muffled voices of the morning staff. Then footsteps in the hallways, soft-soled shoes on marble, the guards changing shift at 6 o'clock sharp. Then the mechanical groan of the front gates opening for the first delivery truck of the day. Each sound was a data point. Each data point was a piece of a world that had been deliberately hidden from him for 49 years. Celeste stirred in the corner chair. Her eyes opened slowly, and for a moment she looked confused. The disorientation of someone who fell asleep in a place they don't belong. Then she saw Lucien at his desk, and it all came back. "You didn't sleep," she said. Lucien didn't look up from the legal pad. "No." "That's stupid." He glanced at her. In his entire life, no one had called anything he did stupid to his face. Not his captains, not his lawyers, not the federal agents who'd tried and failed to build cases against him for 2 decades. But this woman who cleaned floors and made $9 an hour said it like she was observing the weather. "You need to eat something," Celeste said. She stood up, stretched her neck, and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" "To make you breakfast. Unless you've got a chef who actually knows what he's doing, which I doubt, because the eggs I had in the staff kitchen yesterday tasted like rubber." She left before he could respond. Lucien stared at the empty doorway for a moment. Then he looked back at the legal pad, and the name at the very top of the first page, circled 3 times in black ink. Dominic Vale, his father. The phone call last night had confirmed it. The voice on the other end was older, rougher, but Lucien had read those lips for 20 years. He knew the cadence, the rhythm, the particular way Dominic formed his consonants. Even through a phone line, even heard for the first time instead of seen, it was unmistakable. Dominic Vale was alive. And for 12 years, he'd been running the organization from a shadow, pulling strings, redirecting money, controlling the flow of information, while Lucien sat on a throne made of glass, believing himself a king. The question wasn't whether Lucien was going to do something about it. The question was who else knew. Marcus arrived at 7:15. He knocked twice. Lucien could hear the knock now, the sharp rap of knuckles on mahogany, and the sound still startled him. Then entered the study carrying a manila folder and 2 cups of coffee. He set 1 cup on Lucien's desk. Lucien stared at it. He'd drunk coffee his entire adult life, but he'd never heard the sound of liquid being placed on a surface. The gentle thud, the faint slosh inside the cup. Small sounds. Meaningless sounds. Sounds that normal people processed and discarded 1,000 times a day without thinking. For Lucien, every one of them was a revelation. "I ran background on the Maid," Marcus said, sitting across from the desk. "Celeste Navarro, 27. Born in Mill Haven, South Side. Mother died when she was 11, car accident. Raised by her maternal grandmother, Rosa Navarro, who was deaf from age 40 due to untreated chronic ear infections. Celeste was her primary caregiver until Rosa died 6 years ago. Criminal record? Clean. Not even a parking ticket. She's held 7 jobs in the last 4 years. 2 diners, a laundromat, a cleaning service, a gas station, and 2 private housekeeping gigs before this one. She filed for bankruptcy last year, owes $18,000 in medical debt from her grandmother's end-of-life care. Lucien processed this. The profile was consistent with what Celeste had told him last night. A working-class woman with no connections, no agenda, no reason to be anything other than what she appeared to be. In his world, that kind of profile was either genuine or the work of a very skilled intelligence agency. "You think she's planted?" Marcus asked, reading the silence. I think the timing is suspicious. Timing of what? She's been on staff 3 days. The agency sent her because we had a vacancy. Check the agency. I did. Legit. Been operating for 19 years. They didn't know who she'd be assigned to when they placed her. Lucien picked up the coffee and took a sip. The heat against his tongue was familiar, but the sound of his own swallowing was not. He could hear the liquid move through his throat, grotesque and fascinating simultaneously. What about Mercer? Lucien asked. Marcus leaned back. His chair creaked, another sound Lucien had never heard. He's still at the clinic. I've got 2 men on the door. He hasn't tried to leave or make any calls. His phone? Confiscated. His computer? Secured. We cloned the hard drive. Torres is going through it now. Good. Eduardo Torres was Lucien's digital specialist, a former NSA contractor who'd walked away from government work after a disagreement about ethics and found that the private sector paid better and asked fewer questions. If there were electronic records connecting Mercer to Dominic Vale, Torres would find them. There's something else, Marcus said. His voice shifted. Lucien heard it, a tightening, a slight elevation in pitch, the sound of a man bracing for impact. Say it. I pulled the financials you asked for. Mercer's accounts going back 20 years. Marcus opened the manila folder and spread several printed pages across the desk. He's been receiving quarterly payments from an offshore entity called Caravel Holdings since 2004. Payments range from $50,000 to $200,000 per quarter. Caravel Holdings. Shell company. Registered in the Caymans. I'm still trying to trace the beneficial owner, but the structure is layered, thus multiple intermediaries, trust accounts, the whole 9 yards. How much total? Marcus paused. He ran his thumb along the edge of the folder. Rough estimate? Since 2004? Just over $14 million. $14 million. That was the price of Lucien Vale's hearing. $14 million to keep a man in silence, to steal a sense from a child and maintain the theft across 5 decades, through dozens of fake examinations and falsified diagnoses, and at least 1 murder, the audiologist in Berlin that Mercer had mentioned. Lucien set down his coffee. His hand was steady. His voice was steady. Everything about him was steady, and that steadiness was the most dangerous thing in the room because it meant the rage had moved past the surface level, past the blood and adrenaline, and settled into something deeper, something structural, something that would not dissipate with time, but would instead harden into purpose. I need to know who's loyal, Lucien said. Marcus nodded slowly. To you or to your father? Is there a difference? The question hung between them like a blade. Marcus took a breath. Lucien heard it. The full inhale, the held pause, the controlled exhale, the breathing of a man choosing his next words with extreme care. If your father's been running things from behind the scenes, Marcus said, then there are people in this organization who've been taking orders from both of you, maybe for years. Some of them might not even know they're serving 2 masters. The orders could have been laundered through intermediaries, made to look like they came from you. Who would be the intermediary? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the folder. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at the window. All displacement behaviors. Lucien had cataloged them 1,000 times in other people's faces. But hearing Marcus's breathing, the slight acceleration, the shallow chest movement, added a dimension of information that changed the calculation entirely. Marcus knew something, or suspected something, and he was deciding whether to say it. Marcus? Yeah? Don't make me ask twice. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. The scratch of his palm against stubble was audible in the quiet study. Victor, Marcus said. Victor Stein. The name landed like a stone in still water. Victor Stein. Lucien's consigliere, his chief advisor. The man who'd stood at his right hand for 23 years, managing the political relationships, the legal strategy, the delicate balance between the organization's criminal operations and its legitimate business fronts. Victor was 64, silver-haired, Ivy League educated, with the smooth, reassuring demeanor of a man who'd spent his entire career making ugly things look presentable. Victor had been the one to inform Lucien of his father's death 12 years ago. He'd handled the funeral arrangements, the succession planning, the reorganization of the command structure. He'd been the architect of Lucien's reign, or, as it now appeared, the architect of Lucien's cage. "What makes you say Victor?" Lucien asked, his voice flat as plate glass. "Little things," Marcus said. "Things I noticed but couldn't put together because I didn't have the right frame. Decisions that didn't make sense. Deals that should have gone one way but went another. Money moving in patterns that didn't match your orders." "How long have you noticed?" 3 years, maybe 4. "And you didn't tell me." It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. Marcus's jaw tightened. Lucien could see the muscles work beneath the skin, and now he could hear the faint grind of teeth pressing against each other. "I didn't have proof," Marcus said. "And accusing your most trusted advisor without proof in this organization is a death sentence. You know that." Lucien did know that. He'd ordered executions himself based on accusations that turned out to be accurate, but also based on accusations that might not have been. In a world built on trust and violence, the line between healthy suspicion and destructive paranoia was razor thin. "Where is Victor now?" "At his apartment, the penthouse on 8th. He's expecting your morning briefing at 9, same as always." Lucien looked at the clock. 7:32. The ticking was still strange. A metronome marking time in a way that felt aggressive, insistent, like the clock was reminding him that every second of delay was a second his enemies could use. "Move the briefing to 8, Lucien said. "Here, this room." "You want to confront him?" "I want to listen to him." Marcus absorbed this. Then he nodded once, stood, and left. Alone, Lucien pressed his palms flat against the desk and stared at the legal pad. Victor Stein's name was on the 4th page, circled, with lines connecting him to Dominic Vale, to Dr. Mercer, to 3 offshore accounts, and to a series of decisions over the past decade that, now viewed through the lens of deliberate sabotage, painted a picture of systematic betrayal. But Lucien needed to hear it. He needed to sit across from Victor Stein and listen to his voice and let his newly functional ears do what his eyes alone had never been able to. Strip away the performance. Find the truth. Celeste came back at 7:45 with a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee. She set it on the desk without ceremony and sat back in the corner chair like she'd claimed it as her territory. "Eat," she said. Lucien looked at the plate. "I don't take orders." "That's not an order. That's common sense. You've been up all night staring at paper. Your hands are shaking." He looked at his hands. She was right. A fine tremor, barely visible, running through his fingers. Not fear. Exhaustion. His body processing the physiological shock of sudden hearing restoration combined with zero sleep and emotional devastation on a scale that would flatten most human beings. He picked up the fork and ate. The eggs were good, better than anything the mansion's professional kitchen had produced in recent memory. Simple, well-seasoned, cooked by someone who understood that food didn't need to be complicated to be right. "You cook like your grandmother," Lucien said, and immediately wondered why he'd said it. It was the kind of personal observation he never made. Personal observations were vulnerabilities. They revealed attention, which revealed interest, which revealed leverage. Celeste looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know anything about my grandmother. I know she was deaf. I know you took care of her. I know you learned to spot blockages because of her. Marcus told you." "Marcus does his job. Digging into people's dead grandmothers is his job. Knowing who's in my house is his job." Celeste folded her arms. "So what else did he find? My credit score, my high school GPA, the fact that I still owe 12 grand to Mercy General for the last 3 months of her hospice care?" 18,000, Lucien corrected, "and you filed for bankruptcy." Something flashed in Celeste's eyes. Not anger, exactly. Something sharper. The look of a person who has been scrutinized by systems their entire life and has developed a deep, abiding contempt for anyone who thinks a background check tells them who somebody is. "Feel better now?" she said, "knowing my whole sad story?" "I feel informed." "You feel scared. That's why you checked. Because somebody did something nice for you and you don't know how to handle it, so you ran a file on me like I'm a suspect." The words hit harder than they should have. Harder than a fist. Harder than the truth about his father, almost. Because this truth was smaller and more personal, and therefore more difficult to deflect. She was right. Lucien set down the fork. He looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clock ticked. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled through the gates. You should leave, Lucien said quietly. This house is not safe. You told me to stay. I'm telling you different now. Make up your mind. Celeste? What? He leaned forward. The things I learned last night, about my hearing, about my father, they're going to start a war. Not a metaphor. An actual war. With guns. With casualties. People in this house may die. People I trust may turn out to be enemies. And anyone standing near me when it starts is going to be in the blast radius. Celeste studied him with those tired, unimpressed eyes. So you want me to leave before it gets dangerous? Yes. Where am I going to go? Back to the diner? Back to my apartment with the broken lock and the landlord who won't fix the heat? Back to working 3 jobs so I can pay off a dead woman's hospital bills while eating ramen for dinner 6 nights a week? I'll give you money. I don't want your money. The words came out hard. Certain. Lucien heard them the way he was learning to hear everything, but not just the content, but the texture, the weight, the emotional density packed into each syllable. Celeste Navarro didn't want his money. She wasn't performing dignity. She was living it. Then what do you want? Lucien asked. Celeste looked at the plate she'd brought him, at the half-eaten eggs, at the coffee going cold. I want to finish my shift, she said, and I want you to eat your damn breakfast. She stood and walked to the bookshelf and started dusting. Lucien watched her for a moment. Then he picked up the fork. At 8 o'clock sharp, Victor Stein walked into the study. He was impeccably dressed, as always, navy suit, white shirt, silk tie the color of old wine. His silver hair was combed back from a high forehead, and his reading glasses hung from a chain around his neck. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a paper cup of espresso in the other hand. He smelled like sandalwood cologne and dry cleaning. Good morning, Lucien, Victor said, settling into the chair across from the desk with the practiced ease of a man who'd sat in that chair 1,000 times. Marcus said you wanted to move up the briefing. Everything all right? The voice. Lucien heard it fully for the first time. Not just the words, which he'd been reading on Victor's lips for 23 years, but the sound of the man behind them. Victor Stein's voice was smooth, cultured, modulated with the precision of someone who understood that tone was a tool, that pitch and pacing and inflection could be weaponized just as effectively as any firearm. But underneath the smoothness, there was something else, a coating, a veneer, like lacquer on wood, beautiful on the surface, but there to hide what was underneath. Lucien's new ears, still raw and hypersensitive, still processing auditory information with the overwhelming intensity of a system that had been offline for half a century, picked up the coating the way a tongue picks up the metallic taste of a coin. Victor sounded like a man who was always performing. I can hear, Lucien said. He watched Victor's reaction the way a scientist watches a chemical reaction in a sealed chamber, every micro-expression, every involuntary muscle movement, but more importantly, he listened. Victor's espresso cup stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyebrows rose. Slowly, controlled, the eyebrows of a man who has practiced surprise in a mirror. His lips parted, his head tilted. I'm sorry? My hearing, it's been restored. Victor set the espresso down. His fingers were perfectly still. No tremor, no twitch. Lucien noted that, and noted what it meant. Most people, when confronted with shocking information, produce some kind of involuntary physical response. The fact that Victor's hands were completely still suggested not calm, but control. Excessive control, the kind you only exercise when you know you need it. That's extraordinary, Victor said. How? Same word Mercer had used. Extraordinary. Lucien filed that away. A blockage was removed from my ear canal, Lucien said. Something that should have been found and removed decades ago. By whom? A specialist? By the maid. Victor blinked. Just once. A single rapid compression of the eyelids that lasted a fraction of a second longer than a normal blink. Lucien had never noticed this about Victor before. The abnormal blink duration, the way it functioned as a reset, a momentary retreat behind closed eyelids while the brain recalculated. The maid, Victor repeated. Her name is Celeste. She recognized the condition from personal experience. Victor glanced toward the corner where Celeste was dusting a shelf with her back to them. Then he looked back at Lucien. His expression was carefully composed, concerned, attentive, appropriately amazed. His voice told a different story. There was a flatness beneath the words, a hollowness, like a bell with a crack in it. Victor Stein was saying all the right things, hitting all the right notes, but the resonance was wrong. The harmonic that should have been present, genuine shock, authentic joy at his friend and employer's miraculous recovery, was simply absent. "This is wonderful news," Victor said. "After all these years, have you seen a doctor? You should have a full audiological workup. I saw Mercer last night." Something changed in Victor's eyes. Just for an instant, a contraction of the pupils, a hardening of the iris that was there and gone so fast that Lucien would have missed it in the old days, the silent days, when vision was his only channel. But now he had two channels, and the audio confirmed what the visual hinted at. Victor's breathing caught, just for half a second, a tiny hitch in the smooth, measured rhythm, like a record skipping. "And?" Victor asked. "What did Adrian say?" Adrian, first name, familiar, close. The name of a friend, not a physician. Lucien noted that too. "He said the blockage was deliberate," Lucien said. "He said it was placed in my ear canal when I was 4 years old by a physician who was paid to do it and paid to maintain the condition for the rest of my life." Victor was very still, the kind of stillness that has weight. "Lucien, he said my father ordered it." The study went quiet. Celeste had stopped dusting. She stood by the bookshelf with her back still turned, but her hand had frozen on the spine of a book, and Lucien could hear her breathing, slow, shallow, the breathing of someone trying to be invisible. Victor leaned back in his chair. He removed his reading glasses from the chain around his neck and began cleaning them with a small cloth. A gesture Lucien had seen hundreds of times, a habit he'd always interpreted as thoughtful, contemplative. Now, heard through the filter of 24 hours of auditory experience, it looked different. It looked like stalling. "Dominic," Victor said quietly. Not a question. A name spoken with the weight of a man who knows exactly what that name means and has been carrying that knowledge for a very long time. "You don't seem surprised," Lucien said. Victor stopped cleaning his glasses. He looked at Lucien over the rims. A look that might have been sympathetic, might have been calculating, might have been both. "I'm processing," Victor said. "Process faster." "Lucien, if what Mercer told you is true, and I'm not saying it isn't, the implications are enormous. We need to approach this carefully, strategically. We can't afford—" "Did you know?" 3 words, 3 syllables. The simplest question in the world, and it fell into the room like a grenade. Victor met Lucien's eyes. His gaze was steady. His face was composed. He was, in that moment, the picture of a loyal advisor confronting an unjust accusation with dignified restraint. But his pulse. Lucien could see it in Victor's neck, the carotid artery just visible above the collar of his shirt, pulsing faster than it should have been. And Lucien could hear it. Not the pulse itself, but the cascade of physiological effects it produced. The slightly accelerated breathing, the faint rustle of fabric as Victor's chest expanded and contracted more rapidly, the barely audible click of a dry swallow. "No," Victor said. "I did not know." Liar. The word formed in Lucien's mind with absolute clarity, the way a diagnosis forms in a doctor's mind after seeing the definitive test result. Not suspicion, not inference, certainty. Victor Stein was lying, and his body was screaming the truth in a frequency that only a man who'd just learned to hear, a man whose auditory processing was raw and unsocialized, unfiltered by years of learning to ignore the noises that other people's bodies make, could detect. Lucien didn't react. He didn't accuse. He didn't reach for the gun under the desk. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a friendly smile. A thin, controlled rearrangement of facial muscles that communicated nothing specific but suggested everything terrible. The kind of smile that makes a person's survival instincts fire in every direction at once. "Good," Lucien said. "That's good. Because if you had known, if anyone in my inner circle had known, I would consider that the kind of betrayal that doesn't get forgiven. Victor held the smile's gaze for 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then he put his glasses back on and opened his leather portfolio. "Shall we proceed with the briefing?" Victor asked. His voice had recovered its polish. Almost. There was still that hairline crack, that microscopic fracture in the lacquer, and Lucien heard it the way you hear a rattle in a machine that's about to fail. "Proceed," Lucien said. Victor began the morning briefing. Territory reports, revenue projections, a shipping dispute in the harbor district, a city councilwoman who needed financial motivation to approve a zoning variance, the routine machinery of empire, presented with Victor's characteristic precision and authority. Lucien listened, not to the content. He'd been absorbing that information through lip reading and written reports for decades. He listened to the delivery, to the way Victor's voice tightened almost imperceptibly when discussing the harbor operations, to the slight hesitation before certain names, as though Victor was choosing his words the way a man navigating a minefield chooses his steps. And he heard something he never could have seen. When Victor mentioned a lieutenant named Enzo Braga, one of Lucien's harbor captains, his voice dropped half a register, not much, maybe a quarter tone, the kind of shift that a microphone might catch and an equalizer might measure, but that the human ear in normal operation would never detect. Lucien's ear was not in normal operation. Lucien's ear was a newborn instrument, tuned to maximum sensitivity, processing every frequency with the indiscriminate hunger of a system that has been starved for input. Victor was afraid of Enzo Braga, or afraid of what Enzo Braga knew. "Anything else?" Lucien asked when the briefing was done. "One more thing," Victor said, closing the portfolio. "The annual meeting with the district captains is scheduled for Thursday. All 12 are confirmed. I assumed you'd want to proceed as planned." All 12 captains, in one room, in this mansion, in 4 days. Lucien looked at Victor and thought about a sealed room full of men who might be loyal to him, or might be loyal to his dead but not dead father, or might be loyal to whoever paid them the most on any given Tuesday. "Proceed as planned," Lucien said. Victor stood. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up his espresso. And then he did something that Lucien had watched him do 1,000 times, but had never heard. He exhaled. A long, slow, controlled exhale through his nostrils. The exhale of a man leaving a room he wasn't sure he'd leave alive. The exhale of relief. Victor walked to the door. At the threshold, he paused and turned back. "I'm glad you can hear, Lucien. Truly." His voice was warm. His eyes were kind. His body language was the body language of a friend, but his pulse was still hammering. He left. Celeste didn't turn around from the bookshelf until Victor's footsteps faded down the hallway. Then she looked at Lucien. "He's lying," she said. Lucien stared at her. "How would you know that?" "I cleaned houses for 3 years. Rich people talk in front of the help like we're furniture. You learn to tell when someone's full of it. And you think Victor is full of it. I think he walked in here already knowing what you were going to tell him. He wasn't surprised. He was ready." Lucien absorbed this. It matched his own assessment, but hearing it confirmed by someone outside his world, someone with no stake in the politics, no loyalty to any faction, no reason to tell him anything except what she actually observed, gave it a weight that his own conclusions couldn't carry alone. "You shouldn't be in the room for these conversations," Lucien said. "You told me to stay. I told you to stay in the mansion, not in my study during sensitive meetings." Celeste shrugged. "Fire me." She went back to dusting. Lucien pressed the intercom. "Marcus, my study. Now." 2 minutes later, Marcus was standing in front of the desk. Lucien handed him the legal pad. "Page 4, Lucien said. "Victor Stein. I want everything, every financial transaction, every phone call, every email, every meeting that wasn't on the official schedule. Go back 10 years. Marcus flipped to the page. His eyes moved down the list of connections Lucien had mapped. His expression didn't change, but Lucien heard the sharp intake of breath through his nose. "If I start pulling on this thread," Marcus said carefully, "Victor will know. Let him know. Lucien, if Victor is connected to your father, then pulling on his thread means pulling on Dominic's thread. And if Dominic has been running operations behind the scenes for 12 years, he's got fail-safes, contingency plans, people in our ranks who are ready to act if they sense the structure is threatened. I know. You could be starting a civil war inside your own organization. I know, Marcus looked at him for a long moment, the look of a soldier assessing whether his commander has a plan or a death wish and trying to determine whether there's a meaningful difference. "What about the captain's meeting Thursday?" Marcus asked. "It happens. All 12 of them in one room. I want that room wired. Every microphone, every camera, every piece of surveillance equipment we have. I want to hear every whisper, every sidebar, every word they say when they think I'm not listening." Marcus nodded slowly. "And if we find out half your captains are loyal to your father?" Lucien picked up the dark mass of compacted material that still sat on the edge of his desk. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly, studying it the way a soldier studies a piece of shrapnel pulled from his own body. "Then I'll know who to remove," he said. Marcus left with the legal pad and a list of orders that would keep his team busy for the next 72 hours. Lucien sat alone in his study, alone except for Celeste, who had finished the bookshelves and was now wiping down the windowsills with the quiet efficiency of someone who believed that clean glass was a moral imperative. He opened his desk drawer and took out a burner phone, a disposable device he kept for emergencies, though he'd never used one himself, having always communicated through encrypted written messages and his translator. He dialed the number from memory, the same number he'd called last night, his father's number. It rang 6 times. Then a different voice answered, younger, male, hard. "Yeah." Lucien recognized the cadence immediately. Not the voice he'd never heard this man's voice before, but the speech pattern, the rhythm, the particular shorthand of someone who had been trained by Dominic Vale's organization. "I need to speak with him," Lucien said. A pause, then, "Who is this?" His son. The silence that followed was charged. Lucien heard the man's breathing change, a sharp intake, held, then released through clenched teeth, the sound of surprise weaponized into alertness. "Hold!" Footsteps moving away from the phone, a door opening, muffled voices, too distant and indistinct for Lucien to make out the words. But the tone was clear, urgent, alarmed. Then footsteps returning, the phone being picked up, a different hand, a different grip. Lucien could hear the difference in the way the plastic casing creaked. "Lucien!" His father's voice, not through a wall, not through a phone, answered in the dark of night and listened to in stunned silence. This time, it was spoken directly to him, with the full weight of a name that had been his since birth, pronounced by the man who gave it to him. It sounded like gravel and smoke and something colder underneath. The voice of a man who had built a kingdom on cruelty and maintained it through control. A voice that carried authority, the way a river carries a current, not on the surface, but deep, in the mass and momentum of the thing itself. "Hello, Pop." The words came out steady. Lucien was proud of that. Proud that his voice, the voice he was still learning to hear, still learning to modulate, still adjusting to the bizarre reality of hearing his own words exit his mouth and travel through the air, didn't crack, didn't waver, didn't betray the volcanic eruption happening beneath his ribs. "So," Dominic said, "you found out." No denial, no deflection, no pretense. The old man cut straight to the bone, the way he always had. "I found out everything," Lucien said. "Everything. That's a big word. You sure about that?" "I'm sure enough." A long pause. Lucien heard his father breathing, slow, unhurried, the breathing of a man who has been in control for so long that even a phone call from the son he betrayed doesn't elevate his heart rate. "Who told you?" Dominic asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." "Mercer, your pet doctor." Dominic made a sound, a low guttural noise that might have been a laugh, or might have been a growl. Lucien couldn't tell. He hadn't accumulated enough auditory data to distinguish between those two sounds in his father's voice. "Adrian always was soft," Dominic said. "I told him 30 years ago he'd break if anyone pushed hard enough. Should have replaced him." "You should have done a lot of things differently." "Like what?" "Told you the truth? Let you grow up hearing, let you develop normally, challenge me at 16, try to take the organization by 20, get yourself killed by 25? Dominic's voice hardened. Lucien heard it shift, the gravel compacting, the smoke cooling into something denser and more dangerous. "I did what I did to protect you. You did what you did to control me. Same thing. No, it isn't. Another pause. Longer this time. Lucien heard the ambient sounds of wherever his father was. The hum of air conditioning, the distant murmur of a television, the creak of a chair as Dominic shifted his weight. What do you want, Lucien? The question was simple. The answer was not. What did Lucien want? Justice? Revenge? The 49 years of hearing that had been stolen from him? His childhood back? His dignity? A world that made sense, where the man who raised him hadn't crippled him on purpose? I want you to know that I know, Lucien said. That's all. For now. For now. Dominic repeated the words slowly, tasting them. That sounds like a threat. It sounds like whatever you think it sounds like. Don't play games with me, boy. I've been playing games since before you were born. You want to come at me. But understand what you're stepping into. I built this organization, every brick, every foundation, every wall. You inherited it, and everything you inherited, I can take back. The line went dead. Lucien held the phone against his ear for a long time after the call ended. He listened to the static, the empty hiss of a disconnected line, the ghost of his father's voice still echoing in his auditory memory. Then he set the phone down. Celeste was standing by the window, the cleaning rag hanging from her hand, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not pity, not fear, something closer to recognition. The look of someone who has witnessed another person cross a line they can't come back from. That was him? She asked. Lucien nodded. Your father? Yes. The one who paid to make you deaf? Yes. Celeste looked out the window at the city below. The morning sun was burning through the remnants of last night's storm, turning the wet streets into ribbons of reflected light. What are you going to do? She asked. Lucien opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a black ledger, handwritten, analog, no digital copies, containing the complete operational structure of his organization, every safe house, every weapons cache, every crooked cop and compromised politician, every dollar moving through every channel. He placed the ledger on the desk. Then he placed the gun beside it. Then he looked at the list of 12 names, the 12 district captains who would gather in his mansion in 4 days, each one potentially loyal, potentially treacherous, potentially holding the key to whether Lucien Vale survived the week or died in his own home. Something I should have done a long time ago, Lucien said. He picked up the phone again and dialed Marcus. The estate, he said. Dominic's estate. I want its exact location, its security layout, its staffing rotation, and its communications infrastructure. Every detail. I don't care how you get it. Lucien, if he knows you called, he knows. Then he's already moving, already reinforcing. You've lost the element of surprise. No, Lucien said, and his voice was different now, harder, colder. The voice of a man who has made a decision that eliminates every option except the one that leads forward, through the fire, through the blood, through whatever waits on the other side. I never had the element of surprise. He's been watching me my entire life. He knows my habits, my patterns, my weaknesses. He built them into me. Lucien stood and walked to the window. The city sprawled below, gray and wet and vast, a landscape of concrete and ambition and buried secrets. His city, or so he'd believed. But there's one thing he doesn't know, Lucien said. What's that? Lucien touched his right ear. The canal was still tender, still raw, still adjusting to the impossible reality of receiving sound after 49 years of manufactured silence. He doesn't know what I sound like when I'm coming for him. He hung up. In the corner of the study, Celeste set down her dust rag, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing. Because sometimes silence, the real kind, the chosen kind, says more than any word ever could. And in a fortified estate 47 miles outside the city, Dominic Vale set down his phone, looked at the armed men standing in his doorway, and spoke 3 words that would set the final machinery of destruction into motion. Call Victor Stein. Victor Stein answered on the second ring. He was sitting in the back of his town car, 14 blocks from Ravenmore Heights. When the call came through on the phone he kept in the inside pocket of his jacket, not the one Lucien's people knew about, not the encrypted device that Marcus monitored, but the other one. The one that only rang when the old man called. He knows, Victor said. No greeting, no preamble. Dominic Vale's voice came through the speaker like a blade drawn slowly across stone. I just got off the phone with him. He called you? Yes. Victor's driver glanced in the rearview mirror. Victor pressed the button that raised the privacy partition, waited for the glass to seal, then exhaled through his teeth. His hands were steady. They were always steady. But there was a tightness in his chest that hadn't been there an hour ago. The tightness of a man who has been walking a wire for 12 years and just felt it start to sway. How much does he know? Victor asked. He knows about Mercer. He knows about the blockage. He knows I'm alive. Does he know about me? A pause on the line, the kind of pause that Dominic Vale used the way other men used weapons, deliberately, with precision, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage in minimum time. Not yet, Dominic said, but he's not stupid. He'll get there. Victor leaned his head back against the leather seat and closed his eyes. Through the tinted window, the city slid past in a blur of wet concrete and traffic lights. The morning sun had burned through the storm clouds, but the streets were still slick, still reflecting light in ways that made everything look slightly unreal. What do you want me to do? Victor asked. The captain's meeting, Thursday. It's still happening? Yes, Lucien confirmed it this morning. Good. That's our window. For what? Another pause. Longer. Heavier. For transition, Dominic said. Victor opened his eyes. He stared at the privacy partition. The word hung in the car like gun smoke. Transition. In Dominic Vale's vocabulary, that word had only ever meant one thing: regime change. You want to move against him, Victor said. Not a question. I want to protect what I built, what I've always built, what that boy was supposed to maintain, not dismantle. He's not dismantling anything. He's been running the operation effectively he's been running what I allowed him to run. And now he's hearing. Now he's asking questions. Now he's pulling at threads that lead straight to the foundation. How long before he tears the whole thing down? Victor rubbed the bridge of his nose. The headache that had been building since he left Lucien's study was now a steady pressure behind his eyes, a physical manifestation of 23 years of duplicity reaching critical mass. Dominic, he's your son. And the organization is my legacy. Tell me which one lasts longer. The line went silent for a moment. Victor could hear Dominic breathing. Slow, measured, the respiration of a man who had made decisions like this before and would make them again without losing a minute of sleep. Thursday, Dominic said. The captain's meeting. I want 6 of them ready to move when I give the word. Braga, Hollister, Tan, Morrison, Delacroix, and Wells. They've been on my payroll for years. They know the plan. And the other 6? Either they fall in line or they fall. And Lucien? The question filled the car. Victor waited. The partition hummed. The engine purred. The city moved outside the windows in its endless, indifferent choreography. Lucien gets a choice, Dominic said. He steps aside. Voluntarily. Publicly. He hands control back to me through the Council of Captains, and he walks away. He keeps his money, his properties, his life. He just doesn't keep the throne. And if he refuses, then he doesn't keep his life either. The call ended. Victor slipped the phone back into his inside pocket and sat motionless for a long time, watching the city go past. His reflection stared back at him from the tinted glass. A 64-year-old man in an expensive suit with manicured hands and tired eyes, and a secret so heavy that it had bent his spine by degrees over 2 decades, until he couldn't stand fully straight anymore without conscious effort. He told himself for years that this was manageable, that he could serve 2 masters indefinitely, that the wire he walked between Dominic and Lucien was stable enough to hold his weight forever. But wires don't hold forever. Nothing does. And the call he'd just taken was the gust of wind that would either knock him off or force him to jump. Victor leaned forward and tapped the partition. Take me to the office, he said, and cancel my afternoon. 3 days. He had 3 days to decide which side of the wire to land on. And for the first time in 23 years, Victor Stein wasn't sure he'd survive the fall. Back at Ravenmore Heights, Eduardo Torres was having the worst morning of his career. The NSA had been stressful. The private sector had been chaotic. But sitting in the mansion's basement surveillance room at 9:30 in the morning, staring at the contents of Dr. Adrian Mercer's cloned hard drive, Torres felt something he hadn't felt since his first week at Fort Meade. dread. Not because of what he'd found, because of what it meant. He was a small man, 5'6", wiry, with the kind of face that people forgot immediately after meeting him, which was exactly the quality that had made him invaluable in intelligence work. His workspace was a horseshoe of monitors surrounded by servers, cables, and the faint hum of cooling fans that ran 24 hours a day. The room smelled like burnt coffee and ozone. Marcus walked in at 9:45. Torres didn't look up from his screen. "You need to see this," Torres said. Marcus pulled up a chair. The screen showed a spreadsheet. Not the financial records they'd expected, but something else. A medical log. Dates, procedures, dosages, observations. Meticulous entries spanning 4 decades, each one written in the careful shorthand of a physician documenting his work. Mercer kept records, Torres said. Everything. The initial procedure on Lucien at age 4. Follow-up examinations every 6 months to ensure the blockage remained stable. Chemical compounds used to maintain the calcification. Even notes on the sealant, medical-grade silicone, custom formulated, designed to bond with organic tissue and resist natural expulsion. Marcus's jaw tightened. Torres could see it from his peripheral vision, the sharp flexion of the masseter muscle, the kind of involuntary tension that comes from processing information that makes you want to hit something. "There's more," Torres said. He pulled up another file. "Payment records. Caravel holdings like you found." But Mercer also kept a separate ledger, an insurance policy, names, dates, and amounts for every person involved in maintaining Lucien's condition. "How many people?" Torres scrolled down the list. 14 physicians across 6 countries, 2 hospital administrators, and one name that's going to be a problem. He highlighted a line near the bottom of the document. Marcus leaned forward, read it again. Then he sat back and said a word that Torres had never heard him say in 11 years of working together. "Victor Stein," Marcus read aloud. "Quarterly disbursements from Caravel Holdings. Same account structure as Mercer. Starting date, April 2002. 2 years before Lucien took over the organization," Torres said. "Victor was on Dominic's payroll before Lucien ever sat in the big chair." Marcus stared at the screen. His hands were on his knees, fingers pressing into the fabric of his pants hard enough to leave impressions. Torres watched him process the information. The military discipline holding, but barely, like a levee holding back a flood. "Does Lucien know about Victor?" Torres asked. "He suspects. This confirms it. There's one more thing." Torres hesitated. He pulled up a final document, an email chain encrypted, recovered from a hidden partition on Mercer's hard drive. This was sent 6 days ago, before any of this happened, before the Maid, before Lucien's hearing was restored. Marcus read the email. His face went blank. The dangerous kind of blank. The kind that military people adopt when their emotional response to information would compromise their ability to act on it. The email was from Victor Stein to Dr. Adrian Mercer. 3 sentences. The first, routine maintenance check needed on the primary patient. The second, schedule within the month. The third, confirm with the usual account. Routine maintenance. On the primary patient, 6 days before Celeste Navarro pulled a blockage out of Lucien Vale's ear. Victor was scheduling another procedure, Marcus said quietly, to reinforce the blockage. Or check its stability, Torres said. Either way, it means Victor was actively managing Lucien's condition as recently as last week. This isn't ancient history. This is ongoing. Marcus stood up. The chair rolled backward and hit the wall. He stood in the middle of the surveillance room with his hands at his sides, breathing through his nose, his jaw working in slow, grinding circles. "Print everything," he said. "Encrypted drive, hard copies, my eyes only." Done. Marcus took the stairs 2 at a time. The hallway on the main floor was quiet. The morning staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew on Lucien's orders, and the guards moved through the corridors with the careful, alert postures of men who could feel the atmospheric pressure changing inside the mansion. He knocked on the study door, twice. Waited. "Come in." Lucien was standing by the window. Celeste was gone. Probably in the kitchen, Marcus guessed, or cleaning some other part of the mansion with the stubborn determination she'd been displaying since she arrived. Lucien's silhouette against the morning light was stark, angular, the shadow of a man whose outline had been sharpened by sleeplessness and rage. Marcus closed the door behind him. "We found proof," Marcus said. Lucien didn't turn from the window. "About Victor. Financial records connecting him to Caravel Holdings. Same payment structure as Mercer, going back to 2002. Before I took over. Yes. And there's something else." Marcus laid the printed email on the desk. 6 days ago, Victor emailed Mercer requesting a maintenance procedure on you. Routine reinforcement of the blockage. Now Lucien turned. He crossed the room in 3 strides and picked up the email. He read it. His eyes moved across the 3 sentences with the same surgical speed he applied to every piece of written information, and Marcus watched his face change. Not dramatically, not with the explosive rage Marcus had half expected. The change was subtler and more frightening. A deepening of the lines around Lucien's eyes, a hollowing of the cheeks, a recession of something human behind the mask of composure, like watching a house go dark, room by room, until only one light remains. 6 days ago, Lucien said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who has been hit so many times that he stopped flinching and started counting. If Celeste hadn't found the blockage when she did, I know. Lucien set the email down. Mercer would have reinforced it, and I'd still be deaf, still controlled, still performing a role that my father and my consigliere scripted for me. He walked back to the window. The city glittered below, morning sun on wet glass, traffic flowing through arteries of concrete, a million people going about their lives in the shadow of an empire they didn't know existed. 23 years, Lucien said. Victor sat across from me at this desk every morning for 23 years. He briefed me, he advised me, he shaped my decisions, and every single day he went home and reported to my father. Every single day he looked me in the face and lied. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. The mathematics of betrayal didn't require commentary. The captain's meeting, Lucien said. How many of the 12 can we trust? Honestly, I don't know. The records show payments to at least 6 captains through Caravel Holdings or affiliated accounts. Braga, Hollister, Tan, Morrison, Delacroix, and Wells. Half. The other 6, Reeves, Kwan, Petrov, Santiago, Abrams, and Novak. I can't find financial ties to your father, but that doesn't mean they're clean. They might be paid through channels we haven't uncovered yet. Or they might be loyal. Yes. Lucien pressed his palm flat against the glass. The window was cold. He could feel the city's vibration through it. Traffic, machinery, the subsonic pulse of 10 million lives grinding against each other. And he could hear it. The muffled roar of the world beyond the glass, a sound that 48 hours ago hadn't existed for him. Set up the surveillance for Thursday, Lucien said. Everything we discussed. Microphones in the walls, cameras in the fixtures, recording equipment in the basement. I want to hear every word spoken in that room. And Victor? Victor attends as planned. He doesn't know we have the records. He doesn't know we have the email. As far as he's concerned, I'm a deaf man who just started hearing and hasn't figured out who's who yet. You're going to let him walk into Thursday thinking he's still hidden. I'm going to let him walk into Thursday thinking he's in control. Marcus studied Lucien's face. The man he'd served for 11 years was still there. The discipline, the intelligence, the frightening composure. But something new had been added. Something that hadn't been there before the hearing, before the truth, before the world cracked open and revealed the machinery inside. Hunger. Not for power. Not for revenge, exactly. Something rawer than that. The hunger of a man who has spent his entire life navigating a maze and just discovered that someone built the walls. Lucien, Marcus said, you need to sleep. I'll sleep when it's over. You'll make mistakes if you don't rest. You know that. I've been making mistakes for 38 years. I just didn't know it. Marcus let that sit. Then he nodded once and walked to the door. Marcus. He stopped. The 6 captains who might be clean. Reeves, Kwan, Petrov, Santiago, Abrams, Novak. I want private meetings with each of them before Thursday. Off-site. Locations they don't expect. No advance notice. You want to vet them. I want to listen to them. Hear them talk about the organization, about Victor, about my father. Their voices will tell me what their words won't. Marcus opened the door. In the hallway outside, Celeste was mopping the marble floor. She looked up as Marcus passed, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second. A look that communicated nothing specific but acknowledged the gravity of what was unfolding inside the study behind them. Marcus walked past. Celeste went back to mopping, and in the study, Lucien Vale sat down at his desk, opened the black ledger, and began rewriting the plan for Thursday. A plan that had just changed from a routine leadership meeting into something far more dangerous. A trap. The next 48 hours moved like a countdown. Tuesday morning, Lucien met Captain James Reeves at a dockside warehouse in the Harbor District. Reeves was 41, built like a middleweight, with a scar across his chin from a knife fight 8 years ago and the permanently narrowed eyes of a man who had grown up in the kind of neighborhood where eye contact was either an invitation or a threat. He ran the shipping operations, the legitimate ones and the ones that weren't. Reeves walked in expecting a routine check-in. He found Lucien sitting alone at a metal table in the middle of the empty warehouse. No guards, no translator, no buffer of any kind. "Sit," Lucien said. Reeves sat. His confusion was visible on his face and audible in his voice. A roughness, a hesitation, the vocal equivalent of a man standing on unfamiliar ground. "You're talking," Reeves said. "I can hear." "Since when?" "Since Sunday." Reeves processed this. Lucien watched his face and listened to his breathing. Steady, surprised but not panicked. The breathing of a man encountering unexpected information, not a man whose secret is about to be exposed. "How?" Reeves asked. "Doesn't matter. What matters is what I'm hearing now that I can listen." Lucien spent 45 minutes with Reeves. He asked about operations, about territory, about the other captains. He asked about Victor Stein. He asked about Dominic Vale, watching for the involuntary flinch, the vocal fracture, the microsecond of hesitation that would indicate prior knowledge of the old man's survival. Reeves passed. His voice was consistent. His surprise at the mention of Dominic being alive was genuine. Lucien heard it in the sharp intake of breath, the elevation of pitch, the genuine confusion of a man hearing something impossible for the first time. "You're telling me the old man's been alive this whole time?" Reeves said. His chair scraped against the concrete floor as he leaned forward. 12 years? 12 years. And he's been, what, running things from behind the curtain? Through intermediaries. Reeves sat with that for a moment. Then he asked the question that told Lucien everything he needed to know about where the man's loyalties actually lay. Who? Not why. Not how is that possible. Not what are you going to do about it. Who? The question of a soldier who wants to know where the enemy is so he can point his weapon in the right direction. "I'm working on that," Lucien said. Reeves nodded. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. "What do you need from me?" "Thursday, the captain's meeting. I need you to come prepared." "Prepared for what?" "For the possibility that half the men in that room aren't on our side." Reeves held Lucien's gaze. The warehouse was silent except for the distant sound of harbor activity. Ship horns, the clank of container cranes, the groan of heavy equipment. Sounds that Lucien was still learning to process, still sorting into categories of relevant and irrelevant. "I'm on your side," Reeves said. His voice was level. No crack. No waver. "Always have been." Lucien believed him. He repeated the process 5 more times over the next 2 days. Quan, in the back room of a noodle shop in Chinatown. Petrov at a boxing gym in the meatpacking district. Santiago at a parking garage downtown. Abrams at a laundromat in the East End. Novak at a storage facility off the highway. Each meeting followed the same pattern. Arrive unannounced. Sit alone. Watch their faces and listen to their voices. Ask about the organization. Mention Dominic Vale. Measure the response. 4 of them passed. Quan, Petrov, Santiago, and Novak showed genuine shock at the news of Dominic's survival and genuine anger at the implication of internal betrayal. Their voices carried the texture of authenticity, not polished, not rehearsed, but raw and reactive. The vocal signatures of men encountering disturbing information for the first time. Captain Leonard Abrams did not pass. The laundromat meeting was at 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. Abrams was 57, heavyset, with the ruddy complexion and swollen knuckles of a man who'd spent 40 years in a business that rewarded physical confrontation. He ran the construction and real estate operations, the laundering side, the part of the organization that turned dirty money into clean buildings. He sat across from Lucien with his hands folded on the table and his expression carefully neutral. Too carefully. Lucien had been reading faces for decades, and Abrams's face was performing composure the way a bad actor performs emotion, hitting the marks but missing the music. And then Lucien mentioned Dominic Vale, and Abrams's voice gave him away. Not with a crack, not with a stutter, with an absence. When the other 5 captains heard that Dominic was alive, their voices produced an involuntary stress response, pitch elevation, rate increase, breath disruption. The physiological markers of genuine surprise. Abrams's voice produced none of these things. He said the right words. That's impossible, and are you sure? But his vocal delivery was flat, controlled, rehearsed. The voice of a man who already knew what he was being told and was acting shocked because he understood that shock was expected. Lucien let the conversation continue for another 20 minutes. He gave Abrams nothing. No indication that the deception had been detected, no change in tone or posture, no signal that the meeting had just shifted from assessment to confirmation. When Abrams left, Lucien called Marcus. Abrams is compromised, he said. Add him to the list. That makes 7 against 5. I know the math. Lucien, 7 against 5 in a room full of armed men. I know the math, Marcus. Wednesday night, 11 hours before the captain's meeting. Lucien sat in the surveillance room with Torres, reviewing the audio and video equipment that had been installed in the war room over the past 2 days. 12 microphones, 1 embedded in each captain's chair, tuned to capture whispered conversation at close range. 8 cameras, concealed in the light fixtures and ventilation grates, covering every angle. A direct feed to the basement, where Torres would monitor everything in real time. Test it, Lucien said. Torres activated the system. The wall of monitors flickered to life, showing the empty war room from 8 different angles. The audio feed crackled, then settled into the ambient hum of the room, the ventilation system, the fluorescent lights, the barely perceptible vibration of the mansion's infrastructure. Lucien listened. He could hear the room through the speakers, and the room sounded exactly like what it was, a place where dangerous men gathered to make dangerous decisions. We're live, Torres said. Lucien stared at the monitors. 12 chairs around a long table, 12 places for 12 men, 7 of whom had been paid to betray him. 5 of whom, if his assessments were correct, would stand with him when the truth came out. 7 against 5. Bad odds by any measure, unless you changed the rules. Torres, the firearms storage for the meeting. Who manages the security check? Victor's team runs the intake. Everyone surrenders their weapons at the door. Standard protocol. Victor's people hold them in the anteroom until the meeting ends. Victor's people. Yes. Lucien turned from the monitors. Change it. Marcus's team handles the weapons check tomorrow. Victor's people don't touch the intake process. Torres nodded and made a note. It was a small change. A procedural adjustment that could be explained as routine security rotation. But it meant that when the 12 captains walked into that room unarmed, the people holding their weapons would be loyal to Lucien. Small edges. In a room where 7 men wanted you dead, small edges were the difference between a crown and a coffin. Lucien left the surveillance room and climbed the stairs to the main floor. The mansion was quiet at this hour. Guards on rotation, staff dismissed for the night. The hallways lit by low-wattage sconces that cast long shadows on the marble. He walked past his study and continued down the east corridor toward the guest quarters, where Celeste had been given a room 3 doors down from his own. He didn't know why he was walking in this direction. There was no strategic reason, no operational necessity, just an impulse, the kind of human, irrational, uncharacteristic impulse that Lucien Vale had spent his entire adult life suppressing. Her door was open. She was sitting on the bed, reading a paperback novel with a cracked spine and a water stain on the cover. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "I don't sleep." Still stupid. He leaned against the doorframe. The hallway was dark behind him. The light in her room was warm. A bedside lamp with a yellow shade that made everything look softer than it was. "Tomorrow is the meeting," Lucien said. "I know, the whole house knows. Everyone's walking around like they're waiting for a bomb to go off. They are. Celeste closed her book. She set it on the nightstand and looked at him with those tired, level eyes. Are you going to be okay? She asked. The question was so simple, so direct, so devoid of the political calculation and strategic maneuvering that saturated every other conversation in Lucien's life that it momentarily short-circuited his ability to respond. In his world, people asked, "What's the play? And what are the numbers? And who do we need to handle?" Nobody asked if he was going to be okay. Nobody had asked him that in 40 years. "I'll manage," he said. "That's not what I asked." Lucien looked at her. The maid. The woman who'd reached into his ear with her fingernails and pulled out the plug that had sealed his world in silence for half a century. The woman who cooked him breakfast and called him stupid and didn't want his money. The most dangerous person he'd ever met, not because she carried a weapon or commanded soldiers, but because she had no angle, no game, no hidden loyalty that could be leveraged or purchased or exposed. In a world built entirely on deception, Celeste Navarro was the only authentic thing in his life. And that realization, arriving at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night in a quiet guest room with yellow lamplight and a water-stained paperback, terrified him more than anything waiting for him in the war room tomorrow. "No," Lucien said. "I'm not going to be okay." Celeste nodded. Not with pity, not with the false reassurance that most people would offer in this moment. Just acknowledgement. The simple recognition that the truth had been spoken and received. "Then at least sit down for 5 minutes," she said. "You've been standing and pacing for 3 days straight." Lucien hesitated. Then he sat in the chair by the desk near the window. The cushion compressed under his weight. The chair creaked. Outside, the city hummed its endless, sleepless hum. They sat in silence for a while. The real kind. The chosen kind. Then Celeste said, "Can I ask you something? You'll ask whether I say yes or not." "True. Why didn't you leave? When you found out the truth about your father, about all of it, why didn't you just take your money and disappear? You're rich enough. You could have gone anywhere." Lucien stared at the window. His reflection stared back, gaunt, sleepless, older than it had been 3 days ago. "Because running means he wins," Lucien said. "He kept me deaf so I'd be controllable. If I run, I'm still being controlled. I'm still reacting to what he did. The only way to be free of it is to end it." "And what?" "All of it. The organization, the legacy, the machine he built. As long as it exists, I'm inside it." Celeste considered this. "So you're not fighting to keep the empire." "I'm fighting to destroy it." "That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Revenge? Power? The usual stuff." Lucien almost laughed. Not quite. The sound that came out was more like a cough with ambition, but closer to a laugh than anything his face had produced in years. "The usual stuff. You make 38 years of criminal enterprise sound like a bad habit." "Isn't it?" He looked at her. She looked back. In the yellow lamplight, with the city murmuring outside and the war room waiting below, and 7 armed betrayals scheduled for the morning, something passed between them that neither of them named. Not love. It was too early and too complicated and too entangled with trauma and power dynamics for a word that clean. But something adjacent. Something in the same neighborhood. A recognition of mutual humanity in a situation that was rapidly becoming inhuman. "Get some rest," Lucien said. He stood. The chair creaked again. "You too." "I'll try." He wouldn't. They both knew it. Thursday morning, 6:45. Marcus intercepted Lucien in the hallway outside the study. His face was tight. His voice was clipped. The posture of a man delivering news that's going to change the plan. "We have a problem," Marcus said. Lucien stopped walking. "What kind?" Surveillance picked up a call at 3 a.m. from Abrams to an unregistered number. Torres traced it to a relay that bounced through 2 intermediaries before terminating at your father's estate. "What did Abrams say?" "He confirmed attendance at today's meeting, and he used a phrase that Torres flagged." Marcus paused. He swallowed. Lucien heard the gulp. Tight, dry, the swallow of a man forcing words past a throat that doesn't want to release them. He said, "The table is set." "The table is set. A phrase that, in the context of a room full of armed men preparing for a leadership meeting, meant exactly what it sounded like. It's not just a meeting, Lucien said. It's a coup. That's how I read it. They're going to make a move. Tomorrow wasn't just surveillance, they're planning to take the room. With 7 captains loyal to your father, they don't need weapons inside the meeting. They just need to control what happens after. Lucien's mind was already running calculations. 7 compromised captains. Victor Stein coordinating from the inside. Dominic Vale directing from the outside. A meeting designed to look routine but engineered to produce a transfer of power, voluntary or otherwise. If Lucien walked into that room, he was walking into an ambush. If he didn't walk into that room, he was admitting he'd lost control. Either way, his father won. Unless... The weapons intake, Lucien said. Your team's still handling it? Yes. Victor doesn't know about the switch. Good. Here's what we're going to do. He pulled Marcus into the study and closed the door. For the next 2 hours, they rebuilt the plan from the ground up. Every contingency, every positioning, every possible response to every possible move the 7 compromised captains might make. By 9 o'clock, Marcus was deploying his team. Torres was running final checks on the surveillance equipment. The kitchen was preparing the catering for the meeting. Sandwiches, coffee, water. The mundane logistics of a gathering that might end in gunfire. And Lucien was in his study, alone, looking at the gun on his desk. He picked it up. The Beretta felt different now. Heavier. Not in his hand, in his mind. For 38 years, this weapon had been an extension of his silence, a tool of a man who operated in a world without sound. Now it was something else. Now it was the instrument of a man who could hear, who could listen, who could detect the tremor in a traitor's voice and the crack in a liar's composure. He chambered around. The mechanical click was crisp, precise, final. A sound he'd caused 1,000 times without ever hearing it. Now he heard it. And it sounded like a decision. 11:15. The captains began arriving, black sedans pulling through the gates, armed escorts standing down at the perimeter, men in expensive suits walking through the marble foyer and surrendering their weapons to Marcus's security team. Not Victor's, though none of them seemed to notice the change. Lucien watched from the upstairs window. He counted them as they entered. Braga, Hollister, Tan, Morrison, Delacroix, Wells, Abrams. The 7. They arrived in clusters, making small talk, shaking hands with the easy familiarity of men who shared a common employer, though which employer, Lucien now knew, depended on the man. Then the 5. Reeves, Kwan, Petrov, Santiago, Novak. They arrived separately, each one carrying the subtle tension of men who'd been briefed on the situation and told to watch, listen, and wait for a signal. Victor Stein arrived last. He walked through the foyer with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he was about to win. His leather portfolio was under his arm. His expression was calm, composed, professionally pleasant. Lucien studied him from above, and for the first time Lucien felt something he hadn't expected. Grief. 23 years. Victor had been the closest thing Lucien had to a friend, the man who explained the hearing world to him through written notes and patient gestures, the man who translated negotiations, interpreted phone calls, bridged the gap between Lucien's silent existence and the noisy reality of running an empire. Lucien had trusted Victor the way you trust a prosthetic limb, completely, instinctively, because the alternative was to acknowledge that you couldn't function without it, and all of it had been a lie. The grief lasted 3 seconds. Then Lucien buried it, packed it down hard, the way you pack earth over a grave, and turned away from the window. He walked downstairs, through the hallway, past the guards, past the marble, past the portraits of men who'd built this empire on blood and silence and betrayal. He stopped outside the war room door. On the other side, 12 men waited. 7 enemies, 5 allies, 1 consigliere who had been lying to his face since the day they met. Lucien touched his right ear, still tender, still raw, still processing sound with the ferocious sensitivity of a system that had been denied input for 49 years. He could hear them through the door, the murmur of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, the scrape of chairs. The ambient noise of 12 men in a room, each one carrying secrets, each one calculating odds, each one waiting for the meeting to begin. And underneath all of it, Lucien heard something else. His own heartbeat. Steady. Rhythmic. Relentless. The heartbeat of a man who had been deaf and was now hearing, who had been controlled and was now awake, who had been a puppet and was now holding the scissors. He opened the door. 12 faces turned toward him. 12 pairs of eyes. 12 sets of hands resting on the table or holding cups or lying in laps. The room went silent. Lucien stood in the doorway, and for the first time in 38 years of leading this organization, he spoke to his captains with a voice they could hear and a hearing they didn't know he possessed. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice filled the room, and in the basement, Torres pressed record. In the back corner of the war room, Victor Stein shifted in his chair, reached beneath the table, and pressed a button on a device he'd taped to the underside 3 hours earlier. A scrambler designed to knock out every microphone and camera in the room. The monitors in the basement went black. Torres slammed both palms on the console. "We're blind. Audio and video, everything's dead." Upstairs, Lucien heard the faint electronic whine of the scrambler activating. A high-pitched frequency that most ears would dismiss as ambient noise, but that his raw, hypersensitive hearing caught like a needle dragged across glass. He looked at Victor. Victor looked back. And in that look, both men understood that the masks were off, the game was over, and the next 60 seconds would determine which one of them walked out of this room alive. The electronic whine lasted 2 seconds. Then the room went dead. Not silent, but stripped. The invisible web of microphones and cameras that Torres had spent 2 days threading into the walls and fixtures of the war room collapsed like a net cut from its moorings. The surveillance was gone. The recording was gone. Whatever happened next happened without witnesses, without evidence, without the safety net that Lucien had spent 72 hours constructing. Victor had killed it all with one button. The 12 captains sat around the long table, and most of them didn't know what had just happened. The scrambler's frequency was too high for ordinary ears to catch. To them, nothing had changed. The fluorescent light still buzzed overhead, the coffee still steamed in ceramic cups. The room still hummed with the low-grade tension that always accompanied these meetings. But Lucien heard it, and Victor knew he heard it. Their eyes locked across the length of the table, 12 feet of polished walnut between them, 12 armed men around them, unarmed now, technically, their weapons surrendered at the door, but armed in every other way that mattered. Loyalties, intentions, the capacity for violence that lived inside every man who'd clawed his way into a seat at this table. Lucien didn't break eye contact with Victor. He pulled out his chair at the head of the table and sat down. The leather creaked under his weight. He placed both hands flat on the surface, fingers spread, palms down. An open posture, a deliberate one. The posture of a man who wants every person in the room to see that his hands are empty and to wonder why that doesn't make them feel safer. "Let's begin," Lucien said. Victor opened his leather portfolio. His movements were precise, economical, the practiced choreography of a man who had run these meetings for 2 decades. He distributed printed agendas around the table, single sheets, bullet-pointed, covering territory reports, financial summaries, and operational updates. Lucien glanced at the agenda. Standard format, standard topics. Nothing on the page suggested that 7 of the men in this room had been bought by his father, or that the man distributing the agendas had been managing Lucien's deafness like a livestock condition for 23 years. The routine was the weapon. The normalcy was the trap. Victor wanted this meeting to proceed exactly as every meeting before it had proceeded, right up until the moment it didn't. Lucien decided to break the routine first. "Before we start," he said, "there's something I need to share with the group." Victor's pen stopped moving. A micro pause. Half a second. The pen resumed. "As some of you may have noticed," Lucien continued, "I'm speaking differently today. That's because 3 days ago my hearing was restored." The room reacted. Reeves, Kwan, Petrov, Santiago, and Novak, the 5 Lucien had already briefed, kept their expressions carefully neutral, though Lucien could hear the collective tension in their breathing, the slight acceleration that came from knowing what was about to unfold. The 7, Braga, Hollister, Tan, Morrison, Delacroix, Wells, and Abrams produced a range of responses that Lucien cataloged in real time. Braga shifted in his chair. The leather groaned. His breathing was shallow, too shallow, the respiration of a man holding himself rigid. Hollister coughed. Not a real cough, a displacement behavior, a physical tick designed to buy a fraction of a second for the brain to catch up. Tan's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. Lucien heard the ceramic creak under the pressure. Morrison didn't move at all. Didn't breathe noticeably, didn't blink. The stillness of a soldier who has been trained to produce no reaction to incoming information, which was itself a reaction, and Lucien read it as clearly as a written confession. Delacroix leaned back and crossed his arms. A barrier gesture. Protective. The body closing ranks around whatever the mind was hiding. Wells scratched the back of his neck. His fingers made a rasping sound against the stubble. The scratch lasted too long, 3 seconds, 4. The elongated gesture of a man who doesn't know what to do with his hands. Abrams. Abrams was the most controlled. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression interested, his body language open and engaged. The performance of a man who'd been told to act surprised and had practiced it in the mirror, but his heart rate was wrong. Lucien couldn't hear heartbeats across the table. Not yet. Not from this distance. But he could hear the downstream effects. The micro tremor in Abrams's voice when he said, "That's incredible, Lucien." The faint rustle of fabric as his chest expanded and contracted at a rate inconsistent with calm curiosity. The barely perceptible click of a dry swallow after the word incredible. Victor, at the far end of the table, set down his pen and smiled. The smile was warm, concerned, appropriately amazed. "This is extraordinary news," Victor said. "How did it happen?" "A blockage was removed from my ear canal," Lucien said. He was watching the room the way a falconer watches the sky. Scanning, tracking, processing multiple inputs simultaneously. Something that had been there since childhood. Something that should have been found and removed decades ago by my physicians. He let the word physicians land. Let it echo. Let every man in the room hear the weight behind it. "The blockage was deliberate," Lucien said. The room changed. Not visibly. Most of these men were professionals, trained to control their faces and their postures. But audibly, the room shifted. Lucien heard it in the collective intake of breath, the redistribution of weight in chairs, the almost imperceptible tightening of 12 different respiratory patterns, the sound of a room full of men recalculating. "Someone paid to keep me deaf?" Lucien said. "Since childhood. The physician who maintained the condition confessed 2 nights ago." Victor's smile was gone. His face was a mask of grave concern. Eyebrows lowered, lips compressed, the expression of a loyal advisor hearing devastating news for the first time. His voice, though. His voice was porcelain over steel. "Who?" Victor asked. Lucien let the question hang for 3 seconds. 4, 5. Counted them by the ticking of his own pulse. "My father," Lucien said. "Dominic Vale." The room erupted. Not with violence, not yet, but with sound. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping, the cacophony of 12 men responding to a detonation of information that each of them processed according to their own hidden allegiances. The 5 loyal captains produced reactions that were loud, profane, and genuine. Reeves slammed his palm on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. Quan said something in Cantonese that didn't require translation. Santiago pushed back from the table and stood, his hands on his hips, shaking his head. The 7 compromised captains produced reactions that were careful, measured, and performed. Braga expressed disbelief. Hollister expressed outrage. Tan expressed sympathy. Morrison expressed nothing. Delacroix expressed concern. Wells expressed confusion. Abrams expressed all of these things in careful sequence, like a man reading from a script. And Victor sat at the far end of the table with his hands steepled in front of his face, index fingers pressed against his lips, his eyes on Lucien, the pose of a thinker, the pose of an advisor processing complex information, the pose of a man waiting for his cue. "Dominic is dead," Victor said slowly. "He died 12 years ago." "No," Lucien said. He didn't. The room went quiet. Not silent. Lucien could hear everything now, every breath, every heartbeat echo, every involuntary sound produced by 12 bodies under stress, but quiet in the way a room gets when the air itself becomes charged. Dominic Vale is alive, Lucien said. He's been hiding in a fortified estate outside the city for 12 years, running this organization from the shadows through intermediaries inside this room. He didn't look at Victor when he said it. He didn't look at any of the 7. He looked at the center of the table, at the polished walnut surface that reflected the fluorescent lights in warped rectangles, and let the words do their work. Then he listened. The sound of 7 men trying not to react was, to Lucien's newly functional ears, as loud as a symphony. The held breaths, the tightened muscles, the stillness that wasn't calm but control, excessive control, the kind of control you only exercise when your body is trying to do something your mind won't allow. That's a serious accusation, Victor said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was manufactured. Lucien could hear the seams. Do you have proof? I do. From whom? From Dr. Adrian Mercer, who kept meticulous records of every payment, every procedure, every person involved in maintaining my condition. Victor's steepled fingers tightened against each other. The pressure whitened his knuckles. A small thing. A thing that Lucien might have missed in the old days when his world was visual and two-dimensional. But now, with the third dimension of sound, he caught the faint creak of Victor's joints compressing, the whisper of skin against skin as the fingers pressed harder. Records can be fabricated, Victor said. They can. These weren't. How can you be certain? Lucien looked at Victor for the first time since dropping the revelation. He looked at him the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, clinically, precisely, with the detached expertise of someone who can see the fracture beneath the surface. Because the records include your name, Victor. The room didn't erupt this time. It froze. 12 men, 12 chairs, 12 sets of lungs that stopped drawing air simultaneously, like a collective cardiac arrest. Victor didn't move. His hands stayed steepled. His face stayed composed. His eyes, locked on Lucien's, didn't waver. But his carotid pulse, visible in the side of his neck, just above the collar of his white shirt, accelerated from resting to what Lucien estimated was 120 beats per minute in the span of 4 seconds. Lucien, Victor said. His voice was still smooth, still controlled. But the lacquer was cracking now, hairline fractures spreading through the polish like ice fracturing under weight. I don't know what Mercer told you, but quarterly payments from Caravel Holdings, Lucien said. Starting April 2002. Same account structure as Mercer, same offshore routing, same beneficial owner. That's an email from your private account to Mercer's encrypted address, sent 6 days before my hearing was restored, requesting, and I'm quoting, routine maintenance on the primary patient. Victor's hands separated. They lowered to the table. His fingers spread flat on the surface, the mirror image of Lucien's posture, palms down, fingers wide. The room was so quiet that Lucien could hear the fluorescent tubes vibrating in their fixtures, could hear the faint electronic whine of Victor's scrambler, still running, still killing the surveillance feed, could hear, from somewhere deep in the mansion, the sound of a door closing. Routine maintenance, Lucien repeated. On me. Like I was a machine. Like I was a piece of equipment that needed periodic servicing to stay broken. Victor closed his eyes. 1 second, 2. When he opened them, something had changed. The mask was still there, but it had shifted. Not removed, but repositioned, like a man adjusting his grip on a weapon. Everything I did, Victor said, I did because your father ordered it. That's not a defense. It's the truth. The truth. Lucien's voice dropped. Low, controlled, the acoustic equivalent of a blade being drawn from a sheath. You want to talk about truth? You sat in that chair for 23 years. 23 years of morning briefings and strategy sessions and late-night phone calls and holidays, and every single day you looked at me and you knew. You knew I was deaf because someone made me deaf. You knew my father was alive. You knew I was running a kingdom that someone else owned. And you said nothing. You did nothing. You just kept collecting your checks and keeping me broken. Victor's jaw was tight. His breathing had changed. No longer the smooth, controlled respiration of a man in command, but something rougher, shallower, the breathing of an animal cornered. "You don't understand," Victor said. "Then help me understand. Your father would have killed you." The words came out raw, stripped of polish. The first genuine thing Lucien had heard from Victor's mouth in 3 days, maybe in 23 years. "If I hadn't managed the situation, if I hadn't kept him convinced that you were controllable, that the system was working, he would have removed you, permanently. You weren't the only option, Lucien. You were the preferred option, the convenient one. But Dominic always had contingencies. Contingencies. Other people who could sit in your chair, other figureheads, nephews, cousins, outside candidates, people who would have done the job without the complications of being Dominic's son. So you were protecting me. I was keeping you alive. By keeping me deaf. By keeping your father satisfied that his system was intact." Lucien stared at Victor across the length of the table. Between them, 12 men sat in various states of tension, their allegiances now exposed. The thin veneer of organizational unity shattered beyond repair. The 5 loyal captains were rigid in their chairs, hands visible, eyes moving between Lucien and Victor with the focused alertness of men waiting for a command. The 7 compromised captains were unnaturally still, the stillness of men whose plan has just been ripped open and who are trying to calculate their next move in real time. And then Braga moved. It wasn't a large movement, just his right hand sliding from the table into his lap. A repositioning, a reach for something. Lucien heard it, the whisper of fabric, the brush of fingers against something hard beneath Braga's jacket. Something that shouldn't have been there, because every man in this room had surrendered his weapon at the door. Every weapon they'd been asked to surrender, not every weapon they'd brought. "Hands on the table," Lucien said. His voice cracked across the room like a whip. Braga's hand stopped. His eyes met Lucien's. There was no pretense in them anymore, no performance, no loyalty to maintain, just the flat, calculated assessment of a man deciding whether to draw. "Everyone," Lucien said, "hands on the table, now." 5 hands appeared immediately. Reeves, Kwan, Petrov, Santiago, Novak, palms flat, fingers spread. The response of men who'd been briefed and were following the plan. The other 7 moved slower. Braga's hand came up last, empty, but Lucien had heard the hard object beneath his jacket. A backup piece. Small. Probably a compact semi-automatic, ankle holster, or waistband, the kind of weapon that a pat-down at the door might miss if the man doing the patting was loyal to the same person as the man being patted. Except the pat-down had been run by Marcus's team, not Victor's, which meant one of Marcus's people had let a weapon through, or Braga had smuggled it in another way. Lucien filed the information, processed it, adjusted. "Victor," Lucien said. "The device under the table, turn it off." Victor didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, his hand went beneath the table. A click. The high-pitched electronic whine died. The surveillance system, if it could recover from the scrambler, would come back online. Torres, in the basement, would be working to restore the feed. "Here's what's going to happen," Lucien unsaid. He spoke to the room, but his eyes never left Victor. "I know who in this room is loyal to me and who is loyal to my father. I know the payments. I know the channels. I know the names. I have records going back 20 years. He paused. "Let them sit with it. The men loyal to Dominic Vale have 2 options. Option 1, you walk out of this room, you walk out of this organization, and you never come back. You keep your money, your properties, your lives. You just don't keep your seats at this table." Silence. Absolute. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. Option 2, you stay, and you deal with me, not my father, not Victor, me. The man who built this operation into what it is, deaf or not, puppet or not. The man who sat in this chair for 38 years and ran an empire that none of you, not one, could have run alone. He let the words settle, let them sink into the wood of the table and the concrete of the walls and the bones of 12 men. "You have 30 seconds to decide." The clock on the wall ticked. Lucien heard every oscillation of the mechanism. The gear turning, the escapement releasing, the pendulum swinging. Each tick was a second. Each second was an eternity. Morrison moved first. He pushed back from the table, stood, and buttoned his jacket. His face was expressionless. His body was rigid. He walked to the door without speaking, opened it, and walked out. His footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, measured, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had made his calculation and chosen survival over loyalty. Delacroix followed, then Wells, then Tan, 4 of the 7 gone in 12 seconds. They filed out like men leaving a funeral, heads down, jaws set, each one carrying the weight of a future that had just narrowed dramatically. That left 3. Braga, Hollister, Abrams. Braga sat with his hands flat on the table, but his body was coiled. Lucien could see the tension in his shoulders, hear the accelerated breathing through his nose, feel the kinetic energy building in the man's frame like a spring being compressed. Hollister was sweating. Lucien could smell it, sharp, acrid, the chemical signature of fear being processed through the body's cooling system. Beads formed at his temples, caught the fluorescent light, slid down the sides of his face. Abrams was still performing. His hands were folded. His expression was contemplative, but his pulse was hammering. Lucien could see the carotid jumping in his neck, could hear the downstream effects in his breathing, could detect the faint vibration of the table transmitted through Abrams's forearms as his body shook with the effort of maintaining control. 3 left, Lucien said. Braga, Hollister, Abrams. He said their names slowly, deliberately, each syllable a sentence, each name an accusation. I'll sweeten the deal, Lucien continued. Walk out now and you keep everything. Stay, and I will personally dismantle every asset, every account, every piece of infrastructure you've built over the last decade. You won't lose your seats. You'll lose everything attached to them. Hollister broke. He stood up so fast his chair tipped backward and hit the floor with a crack that made half the room flinch. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the fallen chair, yanked it on, and walked out without a word. His footsteps were fast, almost running. The footsteps of a man who couldn't get out of the building fast enough. 5 gone, 2 remaining. Abrams unfolded his hands. He placed them flat on the table. He looked at Lucien with an expression that had finally abandoned performance. No more practiced surprise, no more calculated composure. Just the raw, undisguised assessment of a man weighing his options with the cold arithmetic of survival. You're making a mistake, Abrams said. Dominic won't accept this. He'll come for you. Let him. You don't have the numbers. You just sent 5 captains out the door. That's 5 territories, 5 revenue streams, 5 pieces of the machine that you just cut loose. By tomorrow morning, Dominic will have them all back under his control. Maybe. Not maybe. Certainly. And when he does, he'll come for this mansion, for this table, for that chair you're sitting in, and he won't offer you the same deal you just offered us. Lucien leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his face close enough to Abrams that the older man could see the veins in his eyes, the sleepless hollows beneath them, the physical toll of 72 hours without rest. Leonard, Lucien said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the tense silence of the room, it carried like a shout. I've been deaf my entire life. I built this empire without hearing a single sound. I read lips, I read faces, I read rooms. I navigated a world designed to exclude me, and I dominated it. You think I'm afraid of an old man hiding in a bunker? Abrams held his gaze for 5 seconds. Then he stood. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned back. He's not just an old man, Lucien. He's the one who built you, and he knows every flaw in the design. He walked out. 1 left. Enzo Braga hadn't moved. He sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface, his body coiled, his eyes on Lucien with the unwavering focus of a predator who hasn't decided yet whether to pounce or retreat. Braga was different from the others. The rest were businessmen with guns, managers, administrators, men who ran territories the way executives ran departments. Braga was muscle, pure, undiluted, old-school muscle. He'd grown up on the docks, run his first crew at 17, killed his first man at 19. He was 46 years old and looked like he'd been carved from driftwood, lean, hard, weathered, with eyes the color of harbor water and hands that could crush a man's throat as easily as they could shake it. He also had a gun under his jacket, Lucien hadn't forgotten. "Just us now," Braga said. His voice was low, rough, the voice of a man who gargled with gravel and smoked his breakfast. "You, me, and your 5 boys. That's right. 6 against 1. Not great odds for me." "No." "So why am I still sitting here?" "That's what I'm wondering." Braga looked around the room, at the 5 loyal captains, all of whom were watching him with varying degrees of hostility. At Victor, who was still seated at the far end of the table, silent, his hands on the surface, his face a study in controlled devastation. At the door, still open, through which 5 of his colleagues had just walked to safety. Then Braga looked back at Lucien. "Your father called me last night," Braga said. "Told me to be ready. Told me the meeting was the moment. Told me that when Victor gave the signal, I was supposed to take the room." "Take the room how?" Braga smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who respected competence, even when it was pointed at him. "I've got a piece strapped to my ankle. I walked it past your security because I taped it to the inside of my prosthetic." He knocked on his left shin with his knuckles. The sound was hollow, not flesh and bone, but polymer and steel. "Lost the leg below the knee in 2009. Most people don't check a fake leg." Reeves was half out of his chair. Kwan's hand was moving toward the edge of the table. Santiago's body had shifted into a fighting stance, even while seated. "Easy," Lucien said. Not to Braga. To his men. They held. Lucien looked at Braga. "You're telling me you're armed? In a room where I just expelled 6 of your allies. Why?" "Because I'm not stupid, and neither are you. If I draw, your boys rush me. I might get 1 shot off, maybe 2 before they put me down. Those aren't odds I like." "Then why not walk out with the others?" Braga leaned back. His chair creaked. His hands stayed on the table. "Because Dominic Vale is an old man sitting in a bunker giving orders over the phone. He hasn't been in the field in 12 years. He doesn't know what the streets look like anymore. He doesn't know how the harbors run. He's playing chess from memory, and the board has changed." Lucien waited. "You're sitting right here," Braga continued, "looking me in the eye, telling me you know I'm armed and you're not flinching. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "Tells me you're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest. Either way, I'd rather be on your side than Dominic's." The room held its breath. "The gun," Lucien said. "On the table. Now." Braga didn't hesitate. He reached down, unstrapped the compact semi-automatic from his prosthetic leg, and placed it on the table with a deliberate clunk. The weapon sat there, small, black, lethal, between the coffee cups and the printed agendas, like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. Lucien looked at the gun. Then he looked at Braga. "Welcome back," he said. Braga nodded once, the nod of a man who has switched allegiances and understands exactly what that means. Victor stood up. The movement was sudden, not violent, but abrupt, carrying the energy of a man who has been sitting still for too long and can no longer contain whatever is building inside him. His chair rolled backward, his hands came off the table. His portfolio fell to the floor, pages scattering. "This is a mistake," Victor said. His voice was different now. The Polish was gone. The lacquer was gone. What remained was raw, hoarse, the voice of a man stripped of his defenses. "You think you've won because you cleared the room? You haven't won anything. Those 5 captains who walked out, they're on the phone right now. They're calling Dominic. They're telling him everything." "I know," Lucien said. "He'll mobilize within hours. He has men. He has weapons. He has contingencies you haven't even imagined. He's been planning for this eventuality for 12 years, Lucien. 12 years of scenarios and fail-safes and backup plans." "I know." "Then what the hell are you doing?" Lucien stood. The chair rolled back. He placed his hands flat on the table and leaned forward, his weight on his arms, his shadow falling across the polished surface like a blade across skin. "I'm doing what I should have done the moment I heard the truth," Lucien said. "I'm ending it." "Ending what?" "Everything." Victor's eyes widened. For the first time, Lucien saw genuine shock on the consigliere's face. Not the practiced variety, not the diplomatic approximation, but the real thing. The shock of a man who has just realized that the person across the table isn't trying to win the game. He's trying to flip the table. "The organization," Lucien said. the territories, the accounts, the political connections, the shipping lanes and the construction fronts and the money laundering operations, all of it. I'm not taking it from my father. I'm burning it down. You can't. I've already started. Torres has been compiling records for 72 hours. Financial transactions, communication logs, operational blueprints, everything the federal government would need to dismantle this organization from the ground up. Victor's face went white. Not pale, white. The blood drained from his skin so rapidly that Lucien could see the transformation happen in real time, like watching a photograph develop in reverse. You're going to hand everything to the feds, Victor whispered. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to trigger investigations, enough to freeze accounts, enough to make the infrastructure uninhabitable for anyone who tries to maintain it. You'll destroy yourself. You're part of this. Your fingerprints are on everything. I know. You'll go to prison. Maybe. Lucien, you're talking about dismantling a multi-billion-dollar operation. Thousands of people depend on this organization. Legitimate businesses, employees, families. And how many of those people know that the money paying their salaries was laundered through shell companies funded by extortion, narcotics, and murder? How many of them know that the man who built this empire crippled his own son to keep control? Victor's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. For the first time in 23 years, the silver-tongued consigliere had no words. His voice, the instrument he'd wielded with such precision for so long, had finally failed him. Marcus, Lucien said without turning. Marcus stepped forward from his position near the door. Sir, escort Mr. Stein to his apartment. He stays there until further notice. Take his phones. All of them. Victor looked at Lucien across the table, across 12 feet of walnut and 23 years of deception. His eyes were wet. Not crying, Victor Stein didn't cry, but wet, the physiological response of a body processing an emotion that the mind couldn't yet name. I was trying to keep you alive, Victor said. His voice cracked on the word alive. Actually cracked, the way a plate cracks when you drop it, a clean fracture that splits the whole thing in two. You kept me in a cage, Lucien said, and called it protection. Marcus took Victor by the arm. Gently. Marcus was always gentle with the things he was about to destroy, and guided him toward the door. Victor went without resistance, his body deflated, his 64-year-old frame suddenly looking every one of those years and a few more besides. At the door, Victor stopped. He didn't turn around. He'll kill you, Victor said. When he finds out what you're planning, he'll kill you before the feds ever see a single document. He can try. Victor walked out. Marcus followed. Their footsteps faded down the marble hallway, one set measured, one set shuffling, and then they were gone. Lucien stood at the head of the table with 6 men remaining: Reeves, Juan, Petrov, Santiago, Novak, and Braga, the defector, whose compact semi-automatic still sat on the table like an offering. You heard the plan, Lucien said. I'm bringing this whole thing down, every piece of it. And when I'm done, there won't be an organization left for anyone to fight over. He looked at each of them in turn. Reeves, hard-jawed and ready. Juan, compact and alert. Petrov, massive and still. Santiago, wiry and coiled. Novak, quiet and watchful. Braga, lean and dangerous and newly allied. If any of you want out, the door's still open. No consequences, no reprisal. This isn't your war. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then Reeves said, What do you need? Lucien picked up Braga's gun from the table. He checked the magazine, full 9 rounds, and racked the slide. The mechanical snap of the action cycling was loud in the empty room, sharp and final, the sound of a mechanism being armed. Dominic knows we're coming, Lucien said. The 5 captains who walked out are already talking to him. Victor's arrest will reach his ears within the hour. He'll fortify the estate. He'll call in every favor, every asset, every piece of muscle he can buy. He set the gun down. We don't have the numbers for a siege. We don't have the time for a war of attrition. We have one window, tonight, before he finishes digging in, and we have one shot. How many men does he have? Braga asked. Braga knew the answer better than anyone. He'd been on Dominic's payroll, privy to the old man's resources, familiar with the estate's security infrastructure. When I was last briefed, 30 to 40 armed guards, rotating shifts, hardened perimeter, cameras, motion sensors, reinforced entry points. It's not a house. It's a compound. And we're hitting it with, what, 6 captains and their crews? 6 captains, plus Marcus's security team, plus whatever we can pull together in the next 12 hours. Lucien paused. It won't be enough, not for a frontal assault. Then what? We don't assault, we siege. We cut the power, we cut the communications, we cut the roads in and out, and then we wait. Wait for what? For my father to do what he always does when he's cornered. Talk. Braga raised an eyebrow. You think Dominic Vale is going to negotiate? I think Dominic Vale is an 81-year-old man who hasn't left that estate in 12 years. I think his power comes from distance, from secrecy, from the myth that he's already dead. Take away the distance, expose the secrecy, and the myth dies. And when the myth dies, the men guarding him are going to start asking themselves whether they're being paid enough to die for a ghost. The room was quiet. The plan sat on the table between them like a loaded weapon. Dangerous, uncertain, dependent on variables that no one could fully control. 12 hours, Reeves said. That's not a lot of time. It's what we have. And the feds? The documents Torres is compiling? Insurance. If we don't come back from the estate, Torres sends everything, every file, every record, every piece of evidence. It goes to the FBI, the DOJ, the IRS, and every major news outlet in the country. Dominic doesn't just lose the organization, he loses the legacy. Everything he built, everything he killed for, everything he sacrificed his own son's hearing to protect, it all burns. Lucien looked around the table one last time. Mutually assured destruction, he said. That's the game now. Either we both survive tonight and settle this face to face, or neither of us survives and the whole thing goes up in smoke. Braga picked up his gun from the table. He checked the magazine the same way Lucien had. A mirror gesture, 2 men performing the same ritual of preparation, the ancient choreography of violence. I know the estate, Braga said. I've been there. I know the layout, the blind spots, the rotation patterns. If we're doing this, I can get us through the perimeter. Lucien looked at him. The man who, 30 minutes ago, had been sitting at this table with a hidden gun and orders to take the room. The man who had switched sides because he calculated that a living king was worth more than a hidden ghost. Trust was a luxury Lucien couldn't afford. But utility he could work with. Draw me the layout, Lucien said. Everything you remember, every entrance, every camera angle, every weakness. Braga pulled the agenda toward him, flipped it over to the blank side, and began sketching with a pen borrowed from the table. His lines were quick, confident, the marks of a man who'd walked those grounds and memorized them with the instinct of someone who always identifies the exits before he sits down. The other captains gathered around. Reeves anchored one end of the table. Santiago took notes. Juan studied the sketch with the analytical focus of a man who'd run logistics operations across 3 continents. And Lucien stood at the head of the table, watching and listening, processing the visual and auditory information simultaneously. The scratch of pen on paper, the murmur of tactical discussion, the accelerated breathing of 6 men preparing for something that might kill them all. In the basement, Torres's monitors flickered back to life. The scrambler was off. The cameras were recording again. The microphones were hot. Torres leaned toward the screen, watching the war room from 8 angles. He saw 6 men huddled around a hand-drawn map. He saw coffee going cold. He saw the compact semi-automatic sitting on the table like a centerpiece. And he heard Lucien's voice clear and steady through the speakers, saying words that would change everything. We move at midnight. 8 hours. 8 hours to assemble a strike force, plan an approach, cut the utilities to a fortified estate, and confront the man who had stolen his son's hearing, faked his own death, and run a criminal empire from the shadows for 12 years. 8 hours. The clock on the wall ticked. Lucien heard every second. And somewhere across the city, in a room full of armed men, Dominic Vale received the phone call from Leonard Abrams and learned that his puppet king had cut his strings. The old man sat in his chair for a long time. His guards watched from the doorway. The television murmured in the background. The estate's security systems hummed their electronic lullabies. Then Dominic Vale stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the approaching night. His son was coming. And for the first time in 12 years, the man who had controlled everything from the shadows felt something he hadn't felt since the day he faked his own death and retreated behind walls of concrete and steel and silence. Fear. Not of Lucien, of what Lucien had become. Because Dominic had designed a puppet, dependent, controllable, forever sealed inside a world without sound. And instead he had created something else entirely. Something that had learned to see through silence, to read the world in frequencies that hearing people never noticed, to build power from absence and strength from deprivation. He had created a predator, and now the predator could hear. Dominic pressed his palm against the cold glass and closed his eyes and listened to the silence of his estate, the silence he had chosen, the silence he had imposed on his son, the silence that was about to be broken forever. Midnight was coming, and with it, the sound of everything he'd built beginning to fall. Midnight came with fog. It rolled in from the harbor like something alive, swallowing streetlights and blurring the edges of buildings until the city looked like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The convoy, 3 black SUVs and a panel van, moved through the fog in a tight formation, headlights cutting yellow tunnels through the gray. Lucien sat in the second vehicle. Marcus drove. Braga rode shotgun with a tactical map unfolded across his knees, a penlight clamped between his teeth, his finger tracing the approach route he'd drawn 6 hours earlier on the back of a meeting agenda. The estate was 47 miles northeast of the city, at the end of a private road that branched off the county highway and wound through 3 miles of dense woodland before reaching the perimeter wall. The wall was 12 feet high, poured concrete, topped with razor wire, and monitored by cameras every 40 meters. Inside the wall, the grounds covered 11 acres, manicured lawns, a detached guardhouse, a 3-story main residence built in the 1940s, and retrofitted with the kind of security infrastructure that governments used for heads of state. This was where Dominic Vale had hidden for 12 years. This was where the ghost lived. "Power relay is here," Braga said, tapping the map. His voice was low, clipped, the voice of a man who had switched from boardroom mode to battlefield mode and was comfortable in both. "External transformer feeds the whole property. 1 main line, 1 backup generator inside the guardhouse. We cut the main, they switched to generator. Generator has a 600-gallon diesel tank, enough for 72 hours. "We're not waiting 72 hours, Lucien said. "I know. The generator's exhaust vent is on the north side of the guardhouse, exposed. If Santiago's team can get close enough, they can block the vent. Generator overheats, shuts down automatically. Total blackout." "How long between main power cut and generator activation?" 12 seconds. Standard transfer switch. That's our window for the cameras. 12 seconds of blindness. 12 seconds when the estate's security would be flying dark. No cameras, no motion sensors, no infrared. 12 seconds to get bodies through the perimeter before the backup systems kicked in. And then, if Santiago's team did their job, permanent darkness. Marcus drove in silence, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. Lucien could hear his breathing, steady, controlled, the respiration of a man who'd been in combat before and had made his peace with what that meant. The engine hummed. The tires whispered on wet asphalt. The fog pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. Lucien's phone vibrated. Torres. "The package is ready," Torres said through the earpiece. "Encrypted drive. Copies on 3 separate servers with dead man triggers. If I don't enter a reset code every 12 hours, everything auto-sends. FBI field office, DOJ criminal division, IRS financial crimes, and 6 media outlets." "Good." "Lucien." Torres paused. The pause had weight. The weight of a man who spent his life behind screens and understood, perhaps better than anyone, the permanent nature of what was about to happen. Once this goes out, there's no pulling it back. Every name, every transaction, every piece of the organization, it all becomes public record, including yours. "I know. You'll be prosecuted. Probably. You could disappear instead. I can build you a new identity in 48 hours. Clean passport, clean history, enough money in offshore accounts to live 3 lifetimes." Lucien looked out the window. The fog had thickened. The world beyond the glass was a gray void, formless and directionless, the kind of darkness that swallowed landmarks and made familiar roads feel alien. "No," Lucien said. "No more hiding, no more shadows. That's his way. Not mine." Torres was quiet for a moment. Then, "Understood. The package is live. Clock starts now." The line went dead. Lucien removed the earpiece and held it in his palm. A small device, plastic and wire and a tiny speaker that converted electrical signals into sound waves that his brain, his newly hearing, still adjusting, still marveling brain, could interpret as human speech. 4 days ago, this device would have been useless to him. 4 days ago, the world was silent. 4 days. That's all it had been. 4 days since a maid with calloused hands and tired eyes had reached into his ear and pulled out the plug that sealed him inside a prison he didn't know he was in. 4 days to dismantle a lifetime. He put the earpiece back in. They reached the turnoff at 12:40. The county highway narrowed to a 2-lane road, then to a single lane, then to the private drive that cut through the woods like a scar. The trees closed in overhead, dense, old, their branches interlocking to form a canopy that blocked what little moonlight penetrated the fog. The convoy killed its headlights. Braga directed Marcus by memory. Left here, right at the split, straight for half a mile, then right again at the stone marker. The SUV's tires crunched on gravel. The engine noise dropped to a low idle. Every other sound amplified in the darkness. The creak of branches, the drip of fog condensing on leaves, the distant hum of the estate's electrical systems. They stopped 500 meters from the perimeter wall. The vehicles pulled off the road and parked in a clearing hidden by a stand of pines. Doors opened softly. Bodies moved in the darkness with practiced economy. No wasted movement, no unnecessary sound. Lucien stepped out of the SUV and stood in the fog. The night air was cold, damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine resin. He could hear the estate ahead of them, the low drone of the electrical transformer, the occasional crackle of a guard's radio, the mechanical whir of cameras panning on their mounts. He could hear all of it. Marcus appeared beside him. "Teams are in position. Santiago's group is moving to the north side for the generator. Reeves and Kwan have the east approach. Petrov and Novak are covering the west. Braga and I take you through the main gate." "Through the main gate?" "Braga says there's a service entrance, a maintenance access point in the wall, 20 meters east of the main gate. Keypad lock, 4-digit code." "He knows the code?" "He says it hasn't changed in 3 years." Lucien looked at Braga, who was checking his weapon with the calm efficiency of a man performing a ritual he'd performed 1,000 times. The compact semi-automatic from the meeting had been supplemented by a full-size handgun borrowed from Marcus's armory, plus a tactical vest, a radio, and a knife strapped to his good leg. "If the code's been changed," Lucien said, "we're standing in front of a locked door in an open kill zone." Braga looked up from his weapon. "Then I guess we'll find out how much Dominic trusts his own security." At 12:55, Santiago radioed. His team was in position on the north side, 50 meters from the guardhouse. The generator's exhaust vent was visible, accessible. One man with a steel plate and 30 seconds could seal it. At 12:58, Reeves confirmed east approach. Kwan confirmed his team was set. At 12:59, Petrov confirmed west. Novak was in position. Lucien looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back. In the darkness, their faces were shapes and shadows, but Lucien could hear Marcus's heartbeat, or rather, he could hear the effects of it, the controlled breathing, the steady cadence of a body operating under disciplined stress, the biological metronome of a man who was ready. "Cut the power," Lucien said. Marcus relayed the order. 30 seconds of silence. Then, in the distance, half a mile through the woods, a muffled crack. The sound of the main transformer being physically severed from the grid. Not a subtle operation, not a finesse move. A pair of industrial bolt cutters applied to the main feed cable with the kind of brute force simplicity that Lucien had always preferred over elegance. The estate went dark. Lucien heard it happen, the collective death of 100 electrical systems, the transformers winding down, the cameras clicking off their mounts, the motion sensors going silent, the floodlights dying along the perimeter wall. A a cascade of absence, each component dropping out of the acoustic landscape like instruments leaving an orchestra one by one, until only silence remained. Not true silence. Lucien would never experience true silence again. But a different kind of quiet. The quiet of a machine that has been turned off. The quiet that precedes whatever comes next. 12 seconds. Braga moved first, fast, low, covering the distance between the tree line and the perimeter wall in a sprint that belied the prosthetic leg. Marcus followed. Lucien followed Marcus. They reached the wall in 7 seconds, pressed flat against the cold concrete, breathing hard, the fog wrapping around them like a shroud. Braga found the maintenance access by touch. A metal door, recessed into the wall, invisible unless you knew where to look. His fingers found the keypad. He punched 4 digits in the darkness. Lucien heard each beep, electronic, tinny, the sound of a lock being asked a question. A click. The door released. The code hadn't changed. They slipped through. Inside the wall, the grounds were black. No lights, no cameras, just the vague shapes of manicured hedges and gravel paths. And ahead, the dark mass of the main residence. 3 stories of brick and stone and reinforced glass, built like a fortress, silent as a crypt. The generator kicked on. The guardhouse, 50 meters to the north, coughed to life with a diesel growl that shattered the quiet. Lights flickered along the perimeter. Emergency floods, reduced power, enough to illuminate the grounds in patches of harsh white light separated by pools of shadow, but not for long. Santiago's radio crackled in Lucien's earpiece. Vent sealed, generators running hot. 60 seconds, maybe 90. That's how long a diesel generator could run with a blocked exhaust before the thermal failsafe tripped and shut it down. Lucien counted. He could hear the generator's pitch changing, the engine note climbing as the internal temperature rose, the rhythm becoming irregular, stressed, the sound of a machine being strangled. At 73 seconds, the generator died. Total blackout. Again. This time permanent. The estate was blind. Shouting from the guardhouse. Lucien heard it clearly. Men's voices, sharp with confusion and the early stages of panic, calling to each other in the darkness. Radio chatter spiked. Guards trying to coordinate, trying to establish what had happened, trying to find the threat they couldn't see. Braga led them across the grounds at a dead run. Gravel crunched under their feet. The fog swallowed the sound. They reached the main residence's rear entrance, a service door leading to the kitchen, and Braga put his shoulder into it. The lock held. He hit it again. The frame cracked. A third hit, and the door swung inward, banging against the interior wall with a sound that echoed through the dark kitchen like a gunshot. They were inside. The house smelled like old wood and furniture polish, and something else. Something stale, recycled. The smell of a place that had been sealed too long with the same air circulating through the same rooms. The smell of a bunker disguised as a mansion. Lucien's ears were on fire. Every sound was a signal. The creak of floorboards, the tick of cooling ductwork, the distant thump of footsteps above them on the second floor. Guards were mobilizing, moving through the house in the dark, guided by flashlights that cut the blackness in narrow white beams. Braga raised his hand. "Stop!" They pressed against the kitchen wall. A flashlight beam swept through the doorway ahead. A guard, moving fast, heading toward the rear of the house. The beam swung left, right, then continued past. Footsteps fading. They moved. Through the kitchen. Through a service corridor. Through a pantry the size of Celeste's entire apartment. Marcus cleared each room with his weapon raised, his flashlight mounted on the rail, sweeping corners with the systematic precision of a man who'd done this in places far more dangerous than a rich man's country house. The first shot came at the staircase. A guard on the second-floor landing, alerted by the noise, positioned at the top of the stairs, firing down into the darkness. The muzzle flash was blinding, a strobe of white-orange that turned the stairwell into a series of frozen images. The sound was enormous. Lucien's new ears, still calibrating, still learning to process loud noises, registered the gunshot as a physical assault. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure, concussion, a wave of compressed air that hit his eardrums like a fist. He staggered, his hands went to his ears. For a fraction of a second, his body tried to retreat into the old silence, tried to shut down the sensory channel that was flooding him with pain. Marcus returned fire. 2 shots. Controlled. The guard on the landing fell backward with a sound that Lucien would remember for the rest of his life. The soft, heavy thud of a human body losing its argument with gravity. "Move," Marcus said. His hand was on Lucien's shoulder, pulling him forward up the stairs, past the fallen guard. Lucien's ears were ringing, a high, persistent tone that overlay everything like a filter, turning the world's sounds into something distant and distorted. But he could still hear, muffled, damaged, but functional. They cleared the second floor. 2 more guards. One surrendered when Braga appeared behind him in the darkness with a gun pressed against the base of his skull. The other ran and was tackled by Marcus in a hallway lined with oil paintings and antique furniture that crashed and splintered as 2 large men hit the floor. Lucien stepped over the wreckage. Broken glass crunched under his shoes. A painting hung sideways on the wall. A landscape, pastoral, the kind of art that people bought to suggest a sensibility they didn't actually possess. The 3rd floor. 1 staircase. Narrow, carpeted, leading up to a single corridor with 3 doors. Braga knew the layout. Master suite at the end, study on the left, a sitting room on the right. Dominic would be in the study. He was always in the study. The corridor was silent. Not the silence of absence, the silence of waiting. Someone was up there, breathing in the dark, listening for footsteps, calculating distance and timing and the odds of survival. Lucien went first. Marcus tried to stop him, a hand on his arm, a shake of the head, the body language of a soldier who'd been trained never to let the principal lead. But Lucien pulled free and started up the stairs. His footsteps were quiet on the carpet. His breathing was controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way he'd learned to manage adrenaline decades ago, when adrenaline was something he experienced without hearing its effects. Now he could hear his own pulse in his ears, fast and hard, a percussive rhythm that counted down the distance between himself and the man who had made him. At the top of the stairs, the corridor stretched ahead, dark, long. 3 doors, all closed. The carpet was thick, old, expensive, the kind that absorbed sound and gave nothing back. Lucien walked to the door at the end. He put his hand on the knob. The metal was cold. He turned it. The latch clicked. He pushed the door open. The study was large. High ceilings, built-in bookshelves, a massive desk in front of a bay window that overlooked the grounds. No lights, but the fog outside carried a faint ambient glow that seeped through the glass and gave the room a pallid, ghostly illumination. Dominic Vale sat behind the desk. He was 81 years old, thinner than Lucien remembered. The photographs, the old surveillance images, the mental picture he'd carried for 12 years all showed a larger man, a man of physical presence and brute authority. The man in the chair was diminished, shrunken. His hair was white, combed back from a forehead spotted with age. His hands rested on the desk, veined, knobbed, the hands of an old man. He wore a dark robe over pajamas, and his feet were in leather slippers, and he looked like someone's grandfather sitting up late because he couldn't sleep. But his eyes were the same, dark, sharp, unyielding. The eyes of a man who had built an empire on cruelty and had never once looked away from what that required. A handgun sat on the desk in front of him. He hadn't picked it up. "Close the door," Dominic said. Lucien stepped inside. He didn't close the door. Marcus and Braga took positions in the corridor behind him, visible, armed, but staying back. This was Lucien's room. Lucien's conversation. Lucien's war. "You look tired," Dominic said. "I haven't slept in 4 days." "That's careless? I learned carelessness from you." Dominic made that sound again, the low guttural noise that might have been a laugh or a growl. In person, at close range, Lucien could hear the difference. It was neither. It was something else entirely. The sound of an old man acknowledging a hit, the way a boxer acknowledges a punch that lands clean. "Sit down," Dominic said. "I'll stand." "Suit yourself." They studied each other across the desk. Father and son, the architect and the building, the man who had stolen a sense and the man who had learned to live without it. "You could have just disappeared," Dominic said. "Taken the money, taken the maid, gone somewhere warm. I wouldn't have followed." Yes, you would. Maybe. Dominic's fingers tapped the desk. A slow rhythm. Lucien heard the dry contact of old skin on polished wood. But it would have been better than this. For both of us. Better for you, not for me. Why not? Because disappearing means you win. It means the machine keeps running. It means everything you built, the organization, the lie, the cage you kept me in, survives. And I can't let that happen. Dominic leaned back in his chair. The chair creaked. Old leather, old wood, the tired protest of furniture that has supported too much weight for too long. The cage, Dominic said. That's what you call it. That's what it was. It was protection. You keep saying that. Because it's true, Dominic's voice hardened. The gravel compacted. The smoke cooled. You have no idea what this world does to people, Lucien. No idea what it did to me. I watched my father get gunned down in a restaurant when I was 9 years old. I watched my brother bleed out in a parking lot when I was 16. I buried 3 friends before I turned 20. Every man I ever loved ended up in a box or a cell. Every single one. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something older. Something that had been living inside his body for decades. Compressed and contained, leaking out now through trembling fingers and a voice that cracked at the edges. When you were born, Dominic said, I looked at you and I saw everything I was going to lose. Because that's what this life does. It takes. It takes and it takes, and it never gives anything back. And I swore on your mother's hospital bed that I would never let it take you. So you took from me instead. The words landed in the room like a stone in still water. Dominic's mouth compressed. His jaw worked. His eyes, those dark and unyielding eyes, glistened with something that Lucien had never seen in them before and would never have believed possible. I made you dependent, Dominic said. Yes, I made you need the organization, need the structure, need the people around you, because as long as you needed those things, you'd stay inside the walls, you'd stay protected, you'd stay alive. I stayed in a prison. You stayed alive. That's not the same thing, Pop. The word cracked something in the room. Pop. Not father, not Dominic. Pop. The word a child uses. The word Lucien had read on other children's lips as a boy, wondering what it sounded like, wondering what it felt like to say it and hear it returned. Now he knew what it sounded like. It sounded like grief. Dominic's hand moved toward the gun on the desk. Not fast. Slow. Deliberate. The way you move when you want someone to see what you're doing. His fingers touched the grip. Rested there. I'm not going to prison, Dominic said. I'm 81 years old. I'm not spending whatever's left in a cell. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Lucien stepped forward, one step. The carpet absorbed the sound. He was close enough now to see the details of his father's face. The deep lines, the age spots, the slight tremor in the lower lip that might have been cold, or might have been the physical manifestation of an emotion that Dominic Vale had spent 81 years refusing to acknowledge. I'm asking you to let go, Lucien said. The organization, the territories, the money, the control, all of it. Let it go. And then what? And then it's over. Torres has everything, financial records, communication logs, operational blueprints. If I don't call him by morning, it all goes to the feds. Every name, every transaction, every body buried in every foundation of every building this organization ever touched. Dominic's hand was still on the gun. His fingers curled around the grip but didn't lift it. You'd send yourself to prison to stop me, Dominic said. Yes. Why? Because I'd rather be locked up for something I chose than free inside something you built around me. The study was quiet. Outside, the fog pressed against the bay window. In the distance, Lucien could hear his team, footsteps on gravel, radio chatter, the sounds of a secured perimeter. Inside the house, the fallen guards had been restrained. The resistance was over. What remained was this room, this desk, this conversation between a father who had stolen the world from his son and a son who had come to give it back on his own terms. Dominic looked at the gun. Then he looked at Lucien. Your mother would have hated me for this, Dominic said. His voice had changed. The gravel was softer. The smoke had thinned. What remained was something rawer, something that sounded almost human. She died when you were 2. Did you know that? I knew. She had the same eyes as you, same stubbornness. She told me, the night before you were born, she told me that if I ever let this life touch our child, she'd leave. Just take the baby and disappear. He paused. The shaking in his hands had spread to his voice. She didn't get the chance to keep that promise, so I tried to keep it for her, in the worst possible way. You didn't protect me, you crippled me. I know. 2 words. Spoken without defense, without justification, without the armored rhetoric that Dominic Vale had used his entire life to insulate himself from the consequences of his choices. Just 2 words, stripped bare, offered into the space between them, like a man placing his weapon on the table. I know. Lucien felt something move inside his chest. Not the rage that had driven him for 4 days, not the calculated fury that had carried him through the captain's meeting and the planning sessions and the midnight assault. Something else. Something older and more dangerous than any of those things. Something that felt like the first moment Celeste had touched his ear. The sensation of a blockage being removed, of a channel opening, of something that had been sealed for decades finally being allowed to breathe. He reached across the desk and placed his hand over his father's. Over the gun. Over the old, trembling fingers that had built an empire and destroyed a childhood and were now holding on to the last piece of control Dominic Vale had left. Let go, Lucien said. Dominic's fingers tightened. Then they loosened. Then they released. Lucien pulled the gun away. He ejected the magazine. Cleared the chamber. The round clattered on the desk and rolled to the edge, balanced there for a moment, then fell to the carpet with a soft thud. Dominic sat in his chair with empty hands and wet eyes, and the expression of a man who has just set down something he's been carrying for so long that he's forgotten what his arms feel like without the weight. What happens now? Dominic asked. Now I call Torres. I stop the dead man trigger. The files don't go out. In the organization? I dismantle it, piece by piece, quietly. The legitimate businesses get sold. The employees get severance. The criminal operations get shut down. The money gets distributed, some to restitution, some to the people who were hurt. And me? Lucien looked at his father, the old man, the ghost, the puppet master who had run out of strings. You stay here, Lucien said. In this house, with whatever time you have left. No guards, no operations, no phone calls to captains or payments to doctors. Just you and whatever you can live with. And if the feds come? If the feds come, you deal with them the way everyone else deals with them. Honestly. Dominic almost laughed at that. Almost. The sound came out as a wheeze, a dry compression of lungs that had been breathing controlled air for 12 years. Honestly, Dominic repeated, I don't know if I remember how. Learn. Lucien turned toward the door. Marcus and Braga stood in the corridor, weapons lowered, faces unreadable in the darkness. We're done, Lucien said. Marcus looked past him into the study, at the old man sitting behind the desk with empty hands. He looked at Lucien. He nodded. They walked out, down the stairs, through the wrecked corridor, past the shattered paintings and the overturned furniture and the restrained guards lying face down on expensive carpet, through the kitchen, out the service door, into the fog. Lucien stood on the gravel drive outside the main residence and breathed. The night air was cold and wet and tasted like pine and rain and freedom. His ears rang from the gunshot on the staircase, a faint, persistent tone that the doctors would later tell him might never fully go away. Permanent tinnitus. The price of admission to the hearing world delivered via a 9mm round fired in a confined space. He didn't care. The ringing was a sound. It was his sound. It belonged to him in a way that nothing in his previous life, no territory, no empire, no legend, had ever truly belonged to him. He pulled out his phone and called Torres. Kill the trigger, Lucien said. We're done. Torres was quiet for a moment. You sure? I'm sure. The files. Keep them. Secure. If anything goes sideways, if Dominic tries to rebuild, if any of the old captains try to restart operations, then you send everything. But not tonight. Tonight it stays locked. Understood. Lucien ended the call. He stood in the fog and listened to the night, the insects in the woods, the drip of moisture from leaves, the distant rumble of a truck on the county highway, the breathing of the men around him, Marcus, Braga, Reeves, the others, all of them standing in the darkness outside a fortress that had just been conquered without a siege, without a war, with nothing more than a son walking into his father's office and saying the word that had been stuck in his throat for 49 years. Enough. The drive back to the city took an hour and 12 minutes. Nobody spoke. The convoy moved through the fog in formation, headlights on this time, the urgency of the approach replaced by the heavy, bone-deep exhaustion of the retreat. Marcus drove with his hands at 10 and 2, his eyes on the road, his jaw set in the rigid line of a man who is processing what he's seen and filing it in the place where soldiers keep the things that don't fit anywhere else. Lucien sat in the back seat and stared out the window and heard the world. The tires on wet pavement, a constant hiss like white noise, like the sound of the earth turning beneath them. The windshield wipers, rhythmic, mechanical, a metronome marking the distance between where they'd been and where they were going. The engine, a low, steady hum that vibrated through the frame and into Lucien's bones, a reminder that he was moving, that the world was carrying him forward whether he was ready or not. And beneath all of it, the faint ringing in his left ear. The souvenir, the scar. They reached Ravenmore Heights at 2:15 in the morning. The mansion was lit, every window, every lamp, every fixture blazing against the fog like a lighthouse warning ships away from the rocks. Torres had kept the systems running. The surveillance was active. The gates opened automatically as the convoy approached. Lucien got out of the SUV and stood in the driveway. The gravel was wet. The air smelled like rain and the harbor and the exhaust from 3 idling vehicles. The mansion loomed above him, black glass and steel, the monument to a kingdom that no longer existed. He looked at it for a long time. Then he walked inside. The foyer was empty. The marble gleamed under recessed lighting. The grandfather clock in the corner, the one he'd stared at for years without ever hearing it tick, marked the time with its steady, patient rhythm. 2:17, 2:18, 2:19. He climbed the stairs. His legs were heavy. His body was heavy. 4 days without real sleep, a midnight assault, a confrontation with the man who had shaped and shattered his entire existence. The cumulative weight of it pressed down on him with each step, bending his spine, pulling at his muscles, demanding payment for the adrenaline it had so generously advanced. The guest corridor. Celeste's door was closed. A thin line of yellow light glowed beneath it. He knocked, softly. 2 taps. The same knock Marcus used on his study door, and Lucien wondered when he'd adopted that rhythm, when the sounds of other people's habits had started seeping into his own. Footsteps inside the room. The door opened. Celeste stood in a pair of gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt that was 2 sizes too big. Her hair was down. He'd never seen it down before, always up in that messy ponytail. And it hung past her shoulders, dark and slightly tangled, the hair of a woman who'd been lying in bed trying to sleep and failing. She looked at him, at his face, his clothes, the smudge of dirt on his collar, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. "You're alive," she said. "Yeah." "Your father?" "Alive. It's over." Celeste studied him for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open. Lucien walked in. He sat on the edge of her bed because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. The mattress dipped under his weight. The springs creaked. His hands hung between his knees, and he stared at the floor, at the carpet, at his own shoes, at the small stain near the baseboard that Celeste had probably already identified and scheduled for cleaning. "You're shaking," Celeste said. He looked at his hands. She was right. The fine tremor from days ago had become a full-body vibration, a systemic response to the sustained stress and sleep deprivation and emotional devastation that he'd been running on like fuel. Celeste sat beside him, not touching him, just beside him, close enough that he could hear her breathing, slow, steady, calm, the breathing of a person with a clean conscience, the most foreign sound in his world. "You should sleep," she said. "I know. For real this time." "I know." She looked at him sideways. "If I leave this room, are you going to sit here staring at the floor all night?" "Probably." "Then I'll stay." She pulled back the covers on the other side of the bed and climbed in. She turned off the bedside lamp. The room went dark. Not the total darkness of the estate after the power cut, but a soft, amber-edged darkness, city glow seeping through the curtains, the kind of darkness that still has warmth in it. "Lie down," she said from the dark. Lucien removed his shoes. He swung his legs onto the bed. He lay on his back on top of the covers, still in his clothes, still smelling like gunpowder and fog and the cold concrete of a perimeter wall. The ceiling was invisible above him. The room was quiet. He could hear Celeste's breathing beside him, slow, rhythmic, already drifting toward sleep. He could hear the clock downstairs, the guard's changing shift in the hallway, the harbor foghorns miles away, calling to ships that moved through the darkness like ghosts. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 4 days, the sounds didn't assault him. They settled. They arranged themselves into something that wasn't chaos but wasn't silence either. A middle ground, a texture, the ambient hum of a world that was simply continuing to exist regardless of what had happened tonight. He slept. 3 weeks later, the city was different, not visibly. The buildings still stood, the traffic still flowed, the harbor still processed its container ships and fishing boats and ferry routes. But underneath the surface, in the invisible architecture of power and money and influence that had sustained the Vale organization for half a century, things were changing. Lucien dismantled the empire the way he'd built it, methodically, quietly, without fanfare. The legitimate businesses were sold to investment groups who didn't ask questions about provenance. The employees were given severance packages funded by liquidated assets. The criminal operations, the smuggling routes, the protection rackets, the money laundering channels, were shut down one by one, their infrastructure dismantled, their personnel released into a world that would have to find new uses for their particular skill sets. Marcus oversaw the security transition. Torres managed the data. The records stayed locked, a permanent insurance policy against anyone who tried to rebuild what Lucien was tearing down. The 6 loyal captains received their shares and dispersed. Reeves to a shipping company in the Pacific Northwest, Quan to a logistics firm in Singapore, Petrov to a private security consultancy, Santiago to a fishing charter business in the Keys, Novak to a quiet retirement in the mountains, and Braga to a dock workers' union where his particular combination of toughness and tactical intelligence would serve a purpose that didn't require a firearm. Victor Stein cooperated with the transition in exchange for anonymity. He provided documentation, testified in sealed depositions, and then vanished into the kind of comfortable, invisible retirement that only a man with offshore accounts and multiple passports could engineer. Lucien didn't forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't something he was ready for, and he suspected it might never be. But he let him go. Because holding on to Victor meant holding on to the anger, and the anger was a chain, and Lucien had spent enough of his life in chains. Dr. Adrian Mercer turned himself in to the state medical board. His license was revoked. Criminal charges were filed: fraud, malpractice, accessory to assault. The trial would take years. Lucien didn't plan to attend. The mansion was sold. Ravenmore Heights, the fortress, the monument, the tomb, was purchased by a development company that planned to convert it into luxury condominiums. Lucien signed the papers without looking back. The desk, the study, the window where he'd stood and watched the city, they belonged to someone else now, to a version of himself that no longer existed. And Dominic Vale stayed in his estate, alone, with no guards, and no operations, and no phone calls to captains. He was an old man in a big house with nothing left to control. Lucien called him once a week. The conversations were short, 5 minutes, sometimes less. They talked about the weather, about food, about the garden that Dominic had started planting in the grounds that had once been patrolled by armed men. They never talked about the deafness. They never talked about the organization. They never talked about what had happened between them or what it had cost. Some wounds don't heal through conversation. They heal through time, through distance, through the slow, patient accumulation of ordinary moments that gradually overwrite the extraordinary damage. Or they don't heal at all. And you learn to live with them the way Lucien had learned to live without sound, not by forgetting what was missing, but by building something around the absence. Lucien found a house on the coast, 2 hours from the city, a small place, 3 bedrooms, a wooden porch, a yard that sloped down to a rocky shore where the waves came in, and the seagulls circled, and the wind moved through the tall grass like something alive. Celeste came with him, not because he asked, because she chose. She packed her single bag, the same bag she'd arrived at Ravenmore Heights with, containing 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and the water-stained paperback novel. And she got in the car, and she came. They didn't define what they were. Labels felt premature, and both of them were too scarred and too cautious and too accustomed to surviving alone to pretend that proximity automatically meant partnership. They were 2 people living in the same house, eating meals together, sitting on the same porch, sharing the same silence. But it was good silence, chosen silence. The kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words because the words would only get in the way of something more important. The sound of waves on rocks, the cry of gulls, the wind in the grass, the creak of the porch under the weight of 2 people sitting in wooden chairs, watching the evening sun slide toward the horizon. Simple sounds, ordinary sounds, the kind most people heard every day and never thought twice about. To Lucien, they were everything. He sat on the porch on a Tuesday evening in late spring, 6 weeks after the night at the estate. The sun was low, painting the ocean in shades of copper and rust. The breeze was warm, the grass swayed. Somewhere down the coast, a boat's engine puttered through the shallows, and the sound carried across the water. Thin, mechanical, oddly peaceful. Celeste sat beside him. She was reading. A different book now. A thick one with a cracked spine, the kind of book you buy at a second-hand store for 50 cents and discover is the best thing you've ever read. She had a cup of tea balanced on the arm of her chair, and her bare feet were propped on the porch railing, and she looked, in the golden light, like someone who had found the place she was supposed to be. Lucien listened. Not for danger. Not for betrayal. Not for the tremor in a man's voice, or the crack in a liar's composure, or the sound of a gun being drawn in the dark. He listened to the waves, the wind, the page turning in Celeste's book, the tea cooling in her cup, the evening settling over the coast like a blanket being drawn over a sleeping child. He listened to the world, and the world for once had nothing to say except this: you're here, you're alive, you can hear. That was enough. The sun touched the horizon. The light turned from copper to gold to a deep burning red that set the ocean on fire and made the tall grass glow like it was lit from within. Celeste reached over without looking up from her book and placed her hand on his forearm. Her fingers were warm. Her touch was light. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Lucien Vale, the silent king. The deaf man who had ruled an empire without hearing a single sound. The son who had been crippled by his father and freed by a stranger and broken and rebuilt and broken again, closed his eyes and listened to the evening and felt, for the first time in 53 years, the thing he had never known he was missing. Not power, not control, not the fear of other men or the weight of a crown or the cold satisfaction of an empire that obeyed his every silent command. Peace, just peace. The waves came in, the wind moved through the grass, the sun went down, and the man who had spent his whole life in silence finally heard the one sound that mattered, the sound of being free.